Don't forget to hit the subscribe button above so you don't miss a single action-packed Wild Western adventure. Thank you for listening to Gunpowder Justice. Chapter 1. The third guard had gone out to the herd, and the men that had been relieved, having taken coffee from the pot on the fire, were now stretched out beneath tarp-covered blankets. One of the off-duty guards was snoring, and the other was lying, face pillowed on his arm, dead to the world. Whit Anders, wagon boss for Old Man Goodman of the Pine Tree, sat on the edge of his tarp and pulled on his boots. This was his third trip up the trail, his first as wagon boss. So far he had got by, but he had been lucky. Lucky and unlucky. The 1,500 head of steers he convoyed were as jumpy a bunch as he had ever seen. They spooked at anything and at everything. Twice they had run in the daytime, once when a small dog had come charging and yapping down on the flank of the herd, and once when a horse had come undone and pitched off his rider. 3 times they had run at night. What had caused those night runs Whit couldn't say. However, he had his suspicions. One night run had occurred when Bert Guthrie, the straw boss, was on guard, and the other 2 when Buck Walters had been on watch. Guthrie was jealous of him, Anders knew that, and Buck Walters was mighty thick with Guthrie. Stamping on his boots, Whit Anders walked over to the bedwagon, where his horse stood, tied to a wheel. He would just take a little trot out to the herd and see how they were doing out there. The bunch of steers would run if a rider lit a cigarette within sight, or if a careless man popped a quirt against his chaps, or undid a slicker to put it on during a sudden gust of rain. Real spooky they were. As he walked to his horse, Anders passed a long tarp-wrapped bundle on the ground. He grinned down at the sleeper. That was Rip Campbell, and he was part of Whit Anders' good luck. True, the herd had run, but so far they had generally run in the right direction, and Whit hadn't lost a steer. He had started with 1,500 big steers and 11 men, and he still had them all. Rip had been largely responsible for that. Whit liked the wild-haired boy, who lay so quietly in his bedding. Rip liked Whit too, the foreman could tell. He still had a mental picture of Rip, back in the little trail town of Canto. Rip standing, a derisive grin on his square, homely face, and the little gold flecks dancing in his hazel eyes while he took it out of Guthrie. Guthrie had been shooting off his mouth in a barroom, talking about his wagon boss, and Rip had called his hand. Rip didn't even know that Whit had heard that byplay. There was another memory in Whit's mind, too. Another picture of Rip, sitting his horse on a sandbar while the herd crossed the Canadian. A tough crossing that had been. Whit breathed easier now that it was over. He tightened the cinch of his saddle, untied his night horse, and sticking a toe in the stirrup, mounted and rode softly away from the sleeping camp. From under the chuck wagon, the snores of old doughboy Tom, the cook, followed him. Riding away, Whit awakened no one. Men trailing cattle will wake when their relief comes to camp at night. Sometimes other things will wake them, but generally they are too worn out with the day's work to bother about anything but sleep. The herd was a mile from the camp, bedded against a mesa. A little creek ran down from the mesa, and a canyon followed up to the rim. Pretty country but rough, Whit thought as he rode. A bad place for a run. He hoped that the steers were tied enough to stay on the bedground tonight. As he approached the black loom of the sleeping cattle, he began to sing, his voice unmelodious and rough. Over across the herd, the voice of Chuck Blossom, smooth and tenor, was softly lilting the Red River Valley. Where was Buck Walters? Whit strained his eyes to catch sight of the other guard. The cattle were close now. Whit was as near as a man riding guard would get. He looked to right and left. Hal's song had almost died on his lips. Beside him loomed a man on horseback. Whit could see him. The rider had something lifted in his hand. "Buck?" asked Whit Anders softly. The lifted hand came down. A quirt popped against a chap's leg, and with that noise the cattle were on their feet. The quirt popped again. Buck Walters said, "Curse you, Anders. Sneaking horse thief." Hal's horse was beside Whit's horse. Something hard was thrust into Whit's side. The cattle were running full out, and Chuck Blossom's yell was lost in the popping of their hoofs. Fire from that hard object burned Whit's side. He slumped forward. He didn't hear Walters say, "Blast it. I've got to take him with me." He didn't hear anything anymore. 2 weeks later, Hal Goodman sat in the lobby of the Alps Hotel in Denver and scrutinized Rip Campbell with hard, unwinking blue eyes. "You said you wanted to see me?" questioned Rip, sinking down into a big leather-covered chair beside Goodman. Goodman stroked his little beard. That beard and the weathered oak face of the man that wore it were known from San Angelo north, all along the trail. "You're Rip Campbell, ain't you?" said Hal Goodman. Rip nodded. "Then I sent you word I wanted to see you," said Goodman. "I been hearing about you. Likely, if I'd heard about you before you started north, I wouldn't have hired you." Rip lolled lazily in his chair. He was used to talking to these big men, Rip was. He had worked for a lot of them, and while they had power, money, and men to back them, Rip was never nervous in their presence. He had power too. Not the power of men and money, but the power to look a man in the eyes, to face a man through gunpowder smoke if necessary, and to see a thing through. All his life Rip had worked for wages. He was a top hand, none better, but it went beyond that. Rip had been born in the Tonto Basin, had lost his father and his mother in one of the little wars. From the time he was 10, he had either been hunted or a hunter. Something of his success, something of his reputation, was felt in Goodman's next speech. "So you're Rip Campbell," drawled Goodman. "You worked for the Stock Association in Arizona, didn't you?" Rip nodded. "And you're the fella that cleaned up Prescott when it needed it," pursued Goodman. "I was in Prescott." Goodman leaned forward. "What happened to my cattle?" he demanded. Rip felt for papers and tobacco. "They ran," he said, drawing out his makings. "They'd been running, and they ran again, just after we'd crossed the Canadian. We gathered them, and when we tallied, there were 400 head missing, and your wagon boss was gone." "I know that," snapped Goodman. "How did it happen?" "Well," Rip lit his smoke. "We'd bedded against a mesa that had 2 canyons splitting it. That was after we'd crossed the river. That night, come third guard, the herd ran. We got up, and one of the guards come in and said they'd gone east. We rode that way. In the morning, we hunched cattle and combed the country. We got most of them, but Whit Anders was missing. We went back and combed out the country above the other canyon. There was badlands there. You couldn't have tracked an elephant over. It run in a horseshoe and bent down to where the Canadian took a bend. We didn't find the steers that we'd missed, and we worked 2 days trying. Anders didn't show up, and Guthrie said that Anders had gone with the steers and that we had a delivery date, so he brought us along. When we got here, Guthrie paid me off. We'd had words before that." Rip puffed his smoke. Goodman's eyes were keen. "You think Anders got away with the steers?" he asked. Rip looked at the end of his cigarette. "He was a right good cowman, but not that good," he drawled. "If those steers were run over the badlands, it would have taken plenty riders to hold them on the rocks. Then where did they go when they come off the badlands? No. I think Anders was with the cattle when they run, or right afterward, but I don't think he's with them now." "What would you do if you was me?" Goodman drawled the words, his blue eyes half hidden by drooping lids. Rip shrugged. "I count myself lucky I'm not you at the moment," he answered. "What were you figuring to do?" Goodman pushed his questioning. Again Rip shrugged. "Why," he said, carefully choosing his words, "I like Anders pretty good. I thought maybe I'd drop back into that country and sort of look him up." Blue eyes met hazel. Gold flecks were dancing in the hazel eyes, but Rip's face was impassive. "$100 a month and your outfit," grunted Hal Goodman. "Give you $2 a head for every steer you get back. Suit you." "What about Anders?" The hazel eyes were keen. "Why?" Hal Goodman looked at the ceiling. I've sort of raised Whit Anders. Man and boy, I've known him for 20 years. I like him. I'd take it kindly if you'd look him up. Suppose I find him with the steers? Goodman considered that and sighed. If he wanted them steers worse than he wanted my friendship, he's welcome to them, he said. And suppose I find him dead? Rip spoke the words flatly. Then, drawled Goodman, I suppose you'd act according. You liked him, you say? You can consider yourself the pine tree troubleshooter, and I'll back you up. Rip got up from his chair. I'll be on my way, he said briefly. I'd like some expense money. I'll leave you a letter and some money at the desk, said Goodman. 2 months' salary. If you can't do it in 2 months, you ain't going to do it, and you needn't report back. That fit for you? Suits me, agreed Rip softly. Goodman's old blue-veined brown-spotted hand met Rip's young firm tanned one and gripped. Good luck, said Hal Goodman. I'll need it, answered Rip. When he left Goodman, he had a definite plan in mind. There was a big general store, a short distance down the street from the Alps Hotel, and Rip went there to make several purchases. He had ridden a portion of the country in which the pine tree steers and wagon boss had disappeared, and had stopped at one ranch back of the Badlands Horseshoe. Now, in the big store, he bought bib overalls, brogans, a straw hat, and red bandana neckerchiefs. He bought some other things, and came out of the store carrying an armload. He had hardly been gone 10 minutes before another man entered, caught the same clerk that had waited on Rip, and practically duplicated the purchases. You're the second man that has been buying this stuff today, said the clerk to his customer. I can't figure out why you cowmen are going in for Granger rigging. You wrap that stuff up and tell me what the bill is, said the customer. Maybe the cowpunchers have got some sense and decided to farm. The clerk wrapped up the parcel and tendered the bill, feeling thoroughly squelched. Back in the Alps Hotel, Rip Campbell put his new wardrobe into a canvas sack. Leaving his room, he went to the desk where he received an envelope and paid his bill. Then he departed. At the livery stable where he had left his saddle, Rip made inquiries. He did not need to worry about horses. He had been riding Goodman horses on the trail north, and old Hal Goodman had disposed of the whole mount. The livery stableman said that there were freight outfits pulling out almost daily for the south, and told Rip where he might find a reliable freighter. Leaving the livery, Rip encountered Chuck Blossom. Chuck had been celebrating his arrival in Denver and his payday, and he wanted company. Hey Rip, he called. Come on and have a drink. Rip didn't have time for a drink, but he liked Chuck. Sure, he answered. The two crossed the street, entered a saloon, and going up to the bar ordered beer. While they were waiting for the bartender to draw their beer, Rip heard voices in a booth behind him. Turning, he saw Buck Walters and Arch Guthrie drinking together. Guthrie looked up and, catching Rip's eye, said something to Walters. Walters turned to look and then, getting up from his seat, came out of the booth. Hello, Campbell, he said. Celebrating? Some, Rip said briefly. Say, Walters was loudmouthed with the liquor he had drunk. You shot off your mouth down in Canto about what a hell of a man Whit Anders was. What do you think of him now, the son of a bitch? Running off his boss's cattle. I think just the same of him now that I did then, answered Rip, turning to take his glass of beer. He was a good man with a rotten crew. The hell you say, Walters blustered. I was on that crew, you know. Rip's stoic eyes surveyed Walters bleakly. And I still say it was rotten, he observed, and took a gulp of his beer. Walter's face flushed, and Chuck Blossom laughed tauntingly. Come on back and sit down. Buck, called Guthrie nervously. This feller's talking awful loud, blustered Walters, ignoring Guthrie's demand. I'm going to take some of the rough off of him. So you think the crew was rotten just because I was on it, do you? You and some others. Rip set his glass back on the bar. He watched Walters narrowly. It was against the law to go armed in Denver, but that law was not always rigidly enforced. There was a telltale bulge in the waistband of Walter's dungarees. Walters drew back slightly. Some of his intoxication must have been assumed, because his voice was now sober, coldly insulting. "Cow thief always cottons to cow thief," he said deliberately. "That must be why you stick up for Anders." The bartender had gone down behind the bar. Blossom was moving in swiftly, and the barman was coming up again, bringing with him his pacifier, a 10-gauge double-barreled gun. But both moved too slowly. Walters had reached for the gun in his waistband as he spoke, but Rip, perfectly balanced and with the experience of 100 such encounters, leaned in and whipped a short left-handed blow to the third button on Walter's shirt. That third button was just over the solar plexus, and Walters, his breath completely gone, lost all control of his arms. When the bartender swiveled the shotgun, Rip Campbell was standing with Walter's gun in his hand. Walters was on the floor, and Guthrie was settling back in his seat, his hand falling away from his armpit. "Pay for the drinks, Chuck," commanded Rip, his voice hard. "Then we'll get out of here. Guthrie, you make another move like that and I'll take that gun you tote for my collection. Get going, Chuck." "You want them arrested?" demanded the bartender. They framed the play. "If you want them taken in, say the word and I'll get a deputy." Rip shook his head. "They're just playful," he answered. "Keep them here until I leave so somebody won't get killed. Walters, I'm going to keep your gun. It ain't safe for you to have one. Maybe I'll ship it to you, and maybe I won't. Let's go, Chuck." Chuck was ready. Sobered by the sudden action, he had put his money on the bar and stood watching Rip. The bartender, a man of parts, was staring balefully at Walters and Guthrie, the shotgun very much in evidence. "Set still," warned the barman. "You tin horns can't get away with nothing like that in here. When these gents have left, I'm going to count 10 and then pull both triggers. Hear me?" Rip and Chuck Blossom backed out of the door, Rip tucking Walter's gun into his trousers. As the swing doors closed behind the two, they heard the bartender say harshly, "1, 2. Chuck and Rip parted outside the door. Blossom went on toward the railroad station. Rip headed for the warehouse of a freight outfit. He had already made his plan, and now he was ready to carry it out. At the warehouse of Abercrombie & Jones, there was much confusion. A string of wagons was pulled up alongside the loading platform, and sweating men were loading them. Rip accosted a loafer. The wagons, he was told, were leaving for the south, going down into New Mexico. Here was opportunity. Still carrying his canvas sack, he hurried to the livery stable where his saddle was stored. There, despite the curiosity of the ostler, Rip stripped in an empty stall and put on the new clothes. What he had taken off went into the sack, and the sack was tied. Rip got a grain sack from the ostler, put his saddle and riding gear into it, and went back to the warehouse. Dumping his 2 burdens on the platform, Rip found a clerk. "I want to ship them bundles to Trinchera," he told the clerk. "There's a cowboy paid me to get them shipped. Can you take them?" The clerk surveyed Rip. "Got an outfit leaving today that'll go through Trinchera," said the clerk. "Come on, and we'll weigh them up." Rip, lugging saddle and war sack, followed the clerk. "Who's the boss of the wagons?" he asked as he dumped the saddle on the scales. "I'd like to hire on with him for a roustabout. I got a bedroll, and I can work." The clerk looked up from juggling weights. "That's him over there," he said, pointing. "Maybe he can use you." Rip waited until the saddle and the other bundle were weighed. Then, paying the charges, he walked over to the heavy-set, black-bearded man who was watching the loading of the wagons. Sawyer was short and to the point. He asked questions that Rip answered vaguely. Sawyer was a judge of men. He noted Rip's smooth tanned cheeks and his heavy shoulders and the supple movement. "Well," snapped Sawyer finally, "I don't know what you done or why you want to leave Denver. That ain't my business. I'll hire you. Give you $1 a day, and you're Chuck." "Suits me," said Rip. So, when Abercrombie and Jones' wagons pulled out of Denver late that afternoon, Rip Campbell sat atop a tarp-covered mound and stared at the broad back of the driver handling the team. He was on his way. Chapter 2. It took the wagon train over a week to reach Trinchera. The little cow town, perched among the mountains north of the Canadian, was Rip's destination. There Rip proceeded to take several drinks, act as if he had taken many more, and thoroughly cursing the wagon master, get himself fired. When the wagons pulled out of Trinchera, Rip stood in the street and tried to look woebegone. It was a far different Rip that stood in Trinchera's street, from the Campbell who had left Denver. The brogans were battered now, and the bib overalls were caked with dirt. The straw hat he wore denied any acquaintance with the aristocracy of a Stetson, and the blue shirt was dirty and missing buttons. But the greatest change was in Rip's cheeks. A 10-day stubble of rusty beard covered his cheeks. He was dirty. Indeed, Rip was dirty from the skin out. He was playing a role, and playing it for all it was worth. For 2 days after the wagons left, Rip lazed about the little cow town. He drank a little, listened a lot, and at the end of the 2 days knew a few things that he needed badly to know. The next morning, rising early, he washed his face and went down to Trinchera's one general store. In its warehouse were a sacked saddle and a war sack waiting for an owner to claim them. Rip wondered if, at the end of his 2 months, he would walk into the store and get them. From 7 o'clock on, he hung around the store. People went in and out in greater numbers than usual, for it was Saturday. About noon, a light rig whirled up to the store, and a portly bearded man got out and reached up to help a girl dismount. Rip waited until the team was tied to the hitch rack before he moved forward. While he waited, he looked at the girl. Black-haired, olive-cheeked, with flashing black eyes and a warm, generous mouth, she stood waiting for the man to finish tying the team. When the man had secured the horses and started toward the waiting girl, Rip stepped forward. "Mr. Copeland?" he asked, making his voice a whine. Copeland stopped short. "What do you want?" "I heard you wanted hay hands," mumbled Rip, keeping his eyes down. "I'd like to get a job." "Ever cut any hay?" asked Copeland. "I cut hay and stacked," answered Rip. "I'm a good hand at a stack." Copeland grunted. "Got a bed?" "Yes, sir." "I pay $1.50 a day," Copeland's tones were curt, "and you got to get along with Gunny Block. It's a wagon outfit, you know. We move around and cut hay on the Vegas. If you can stack hay, I'll hire you." "I can stack hay." "What do they call you?" demanded Copeland. "Rip," answered Rip Campbell promptly. "Have your bed here at 4 o'clock, ordered Copeland. "I'll take you to the ranch." "Yes, sir," Rip ducked his head. "I'll be here." "If you aren't, there won't be any job," Copeland told him, and crossed the walk to the waiting girl. At 4 o'clock, Rip was at Bart's store waiting. He was still waiting at 5 o'clock, and it was not until 5:30 that Copeland and the buckboard arrived. Copeland told Rip to put his bedroll in the back of the buckboard and jump on, and Rip obeyed the order. A box of supplies was carried out from Bart's and loaded in, and Copeland took the lines and drove the team on down the street. At a dwelling set well back from the road, Copeland stopped. "Go get Charlotte," he said, looking back over his shoulder at Rip. The man climbed out of the buckboard, and going up the walk to the house, knocked at the door. "Is Miss Copeland here?" he asked the white-haired woman who answered the knock. "Yes, sir," was the reply, and he waited. Presently dark-haired Charlotte Copeland came to the door, her arm around a blonde girl who, shorter than Charlotte, was laughing up at her. "I'll be expecting you this week then, Beryl," said Charlotte Copeland. "You'll let her come, won't you, Mrs. White?" The white-haired, motherly woman smiled and nodded, and Charlotte, after kissing both of them, bade them goodbye and walked past the cowboy. Apparently, she didn't see him at all. In the buckboard, leaving Trinchera, Rip sat on his bedroll and listened, unabashed, to the conversation in the front seat. It was part of his business to listen to conversations, and he had no qualms or scruples. But he heard nothing. The conversation between Copeland and his daughter had to do with plans for the visit of Beryl White to the Copeland ranch, and that was all. The buckboard rolled along at a steady gait. Copeland had 2 good horses. Not horses such as a ranchman might be expected to drive, but trotters evidently with some standard-bred blood in them. They cut off the miles, but the sun was racing them and winning. It was dusk before the road swung south, and a full 3 hours had elapsed before Copeland stopped for Rip to open a gate. When the gate was replaced and Rip was back on his bedroll again, the tired horses walked down a lane. Rip could see the fence posts on either side, went through another gate already down, and stopped. A man came running from a lighted building and took the team's bits. Copeland spoke to Rip. "You go down to the old bunkhouse," he directed. "You'll find a lamp down there. Take any of the bunks, and then see if the cook will feed you. I haven't got my hay crew in yet. Just 1 man, so you won't be crowded." With that, he lifted the box of groceries from the buckboard and walked away after Charlotte, who had already gone to the big house that bulked black some distance from the vehicle. "Where's the old bunkhouse?" asked Rip of the man who held the team. "Down back of the house where you see the light, Granger," answered the cowboy. Rip shouldered his bedding and walked toward the light, and the puncher led the team away. Arriving at the bunkhouse, an old rock structure built behind the newer cabin that served the riders. Rip struck matches, located the lamp, lit it, and threw his bed on a bunk. A tousle-headed kid in another bunk rolled over and then sat up when the light struck his eyes. Rip, opening his bed, nodded to the boy. "Just got in," he said. The boy lay back in his blankets. "You'll be out at 3, he said sleepily. "Better turn in." Rip grinned and began to undress. No use bothering the cook at this time of night, and if the tousle-haired kid was right, morning was going to come mighty early on Copeland's triple dot spread. Cupping a hand over the lamp chimney, Rip blew out the light and slid down into his blankets. The tousle-headed kid had been right. Before dawn, there was a yell in the bunkhouse, and a raucous voice demanded attention. "Get up, you Grangers. Want to sleep all day? Get up." Rip rolled over in his bed, and looking at the door, saw in the dim light a short, squat, broad-shouldered man. He sat up in his bed, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and looked again. The man who had called was gone, and fresh morning air was streaming through the open door. Rip grinned at the kid in the other bunk, threw back the covers, and put his feet on the cold floor. As they dressed, the 2 occupants of the bunkhouse introduced themselves. The kid gave his name as Billy Cosgrove. The man who had called them, Billy said, was Gunny Block, Copeland's foreman for the Granger outfit. Gunny was several other things, none of them very pleasant, according to Billy. With their clothing on, the 2 washed, Rip rather thoroughly, Billy with a lick and a promise. Then they went to the cook shack. There were 2 tables set. One had 2 places, the other 10. Billy led the way to the table with 2 places, and presently the triple dot punchers came in and sat down at the big table. There is an aristocracy of cowhands. The true cowman, the puncher, cowboy, call him what you will, does only the work that can be done on horseback or that a horse will carry him to. Haying, making fences, building tanks, erecting windmills, these things were done by a Granger crew. The 10 men who sat at the big table were cowpunchers. That made all the difference. When the punchers had been served, the cook, a cripple with 1 leg shorter than the other, brought food to Billy and Rip. At the big table, the cowmen talked among themselves. At the other table, the 2 ate in a dead silence, broken only by the sound of Billy sucking up his coffee from a saucer. Rip listened to the talk at the other table. As usual, it concerned horses, the previous day's work, conditions of range, and cattle. The usual ranch conversation. Nothing interesting, nothing out of the way. Still, Rip singled out a man or 2. There were a big, bearded one the others called Cole, and a smaller, wrinkled man called Dusty who drew his attention. The two sat together at the end of the table and didn't say much. Apparently they were partners, and apparently, too, they hadn't been with the triple dot very long. The fact came out in the course of the conversation, when Dusty asked for information concerning a certain portion of the country. Two others also drew Rip's attention: Hunter, the foreman, and gray-haired, barrel-chested Runty Gunny. Rip knew that he would have plenty to do with Gunny. Watching the little man, Rip could not help but like him. Gunny Block's face was rode hard, but there was a twinkle in his eyes that promised a good many things. When the meal was done, the cowboys went out, following Hunter toward the corrals and saddle sheds, and Block came over to Rip and Billy's table. "Haying," said Gunny, "won't start till we get a crew. Today you'll clean a tank here by the house. Come on." Billy and Rip rose and followed him. At the corrals, the riders were saddling. Hunter was laying out the work to several, who already had their saddles on mounts, and as the men came out with their horses, he gave further directions. Singly or in pairs the riders left, and finally Hunter was alone. He nodded to Block and said, "It's all yours, Gunny," and stared toward the big house, where smoke was just beginning to come from the chimney. Gunny took hold of Rip's arm. "You see them mules?" Rip saw them, all right. There were 4 of them, big bay animals with long ears and collar galls on their necks. "You'll find some chain harness in the barn," Gunny Block went on. "Hitch them mules to the Fresno in the yard, and then go to that tank over there and scrape out the sand. It's blown full." Block turned away, then stopped. "And don't swear," he admonished. "The tank's right behind the house, and I don't want you shocking the ladies." With that he was gone, tramping off around the corral. Billy looked at Rip. "Them mules are devils," said Billy. Rip shrugged. "Let's get the harness," he proposed. Billy knew where the harness was kept, and he and Rip brought it to the corral. While they were carrying it out, Block, his blue eyes twinkling, passed them again without a word, and went into the barn. "Now," grunted Billy, dumping harness on the fence, "he'll stay in there and watch us and laugh, and when we don't get the job done he'll come out and raise hell with us. You wait and see." Rip's eyes narrowed. "Didn't I see a rope in the saddle room?" he asked. "Sure, there's one there," answered Billy. "But what good will that do us? I can't rope much, and—" "You go get it," drawled Rip. "I never caught a mule yet by putting salt on his tail." Puzzled, Billy went toward the saddle shed. Rip, climbing the bars of the corral, stood in the dust inside, and eyed the mules and the horses that had been left. He liked the looks of the triple dot mounts, and he liked the looks of those mules. Billy came back, carrying the rope, and handed it over the fence. "I still don't see," he began. "Come in here and bring them around for me," Rip commanded, laying out the rope. "I figured to harness them mules." Billy climbed the fence, and Rip coiled the rope and shook out a loop. "Now bring them around," he ordered. There was a snubbing post in the center of the round corral. Rip, rope in hand, walked toward it. Billy started the mules and the few horses around the corral. As the first mule, a big bay, passed Rip, the roper turned his back, his hand flipped out and the open loop stood on its edge like a barrel hoop. The running mule put both front feet through the loop, and Rip, snapping his rope up, snubbed short on the post. The mule hit the end of the rope, went over and thumped on the ground. Billy knew enough to run and sit on the struggling animal's head. Rip, coming up the rope, caught a hind foot in a half hitch, caught the other hind foot and pulled tight. 2 more wraps of the rope, and he straightened. "Just sit there," directed Rip Campbell. "It ain't hard to harness a mule on the ground." In the barn, Gunny Block rubbed his eyes and then peered again through the crack he was using. Rip was dumping chain harness down upon a supine mule. 3 times the procedure was repeated, and each time a harnessed mule was added to those tied to the fence outside the corral. Then, with Rip handling the lines, the mules moved docilely off toward the Fresno. Gunny, carefully slipping out of the rear door of the barn, watched the 4 mules pull the Fresno toward the dry tank he had indicated. Then, Disbelief still in his eyes, the boss of the Granger wagon went hurriedly toward the house. "Farmer," he said as he walked. "Like hell he is." Chapter 3. Copeland was just getting up from the table when Block came in. He walked over to the door, nodded to the old man, and preceded him to the little room that he used for an office. Inside the office, seating himself, he looked up and spoke. "What's on your mind, Gunny?" Block sat on the edge of the table that Copeland used for a desk and swung a short booted leg. "That fellow you hired to hay," he said, "the one you call Rip. He ain't no more Granger than I am." "No," drawled Copeland. "No. You ought to seen him harness them mules. 4-footed them as neat as you please, and laid them on the ground. Granger, hell. He'd make a top hand in any man's outfit." So I'm wondering," said Gunny Block, "if he's another of those range detectives you've been hiring." Copeland sat erect in his chair. "Who said that I'd been hiring range detectives?" he demanded. Block shrugged. "It's plain as the nose on your face," he answered familiarly. "That fellow Cole and that runt Dusty couldn't be nothing else. You've been losing cattle, but I'm darned if I thought that you'd lost so many that you'd throw men in here like them." "Who else thinks they're detectives?" demanded Copeland, harshly. Block shrugged. "How do I know what the men think?" he countered. "When you going to get the rest of the hay crew?" "They'll be coming along as Bart hires them," answered Copeland. "I told him to send out some men, and he said he'd get them." "We got to get to cutting pretty soon," said Block. "I hope Bart does send them. Say, if you want to see something nice, you go out and watch that Rip handle that 4-up of mules. He's getting along right well, and if he handles them many mornings like he did this one, all he'll have to do will be show them a rope, and they'll lie down to be harnessed." Block slipped down from the table, and Copeland stood up. "You keep your mouth shut, Gunny," he warned. "About me hiring men, I mean. That fellow Dusty is from the Stock Association. I don't know where Cole came from. I took him on when I put Dusty to work. I thought that if I hired 2 men at a time, I'd kind of mix things up if somebody was watching. Get it?" Gunny Block grinned. "I get it," he said. "I'll keep shut. And Rip ain't no detective." "Not that I know," answered Copeland. Block's grin widened. "Then he's on the dodge," he said. "A heck of an outfit this is getting to be. Well, I don't care. I don't want to know what he done. He'll make a hand, anyhow." With that, Gunny pulled down his hat and left. When he was gone, Copeland sat back down in his chair and put his feet up on the table. "A heck of an outfit," Gunny had said. Maybe he didn't know just how much of a heck of an outfit the Triple Dot was getting to be. It took 2 days for Rip and Billy to clean the tank and fix up the walls. They did a nice job. Gunny came around and looked at the work and grunted, but he didn't have any fault to find. That was something. The mules behaved. A repetition of the roping of the first morning made pretty good mules out of them. Rip felt that he was earning his $150 a day. He learned a lot from Billy. Billy was a local boy, the son of a nester who was having heavy sledding of it up on the mesa west of the Triple Dot headquarters, and he knew a lot about the outfit. This was his second summer working for Copeland, and he talked freely. From Billy, Rip learned something of the country, something of the Triple Dot. Gunny had been with Marshall since the time the chunk was laid. He was old now, and didn't do any active riding, and his place as foreman had gradually been taken by Herb Hunter. Gunny resented that change, and so Billy said was jealous of Hunter. Billy aspired to be one of Hunter's riders, and indeed, the tall, taciturn foreman showed Billy some consideration. Of the others, Billy hadn't much to say. Most of the men had been with the Triple Dot for a year or more. Only Cole Cook and Dusty Summers were new hands. Harvey Little rode the rough string and was Billy's hero. The rest he just spoke of and passed over. However, there was one person on the triple dot about whom Billy spoke at length. That was Charlotte Copeland. Charlotte had been east to school, and she was stuck-up, big-headed, and conceited, according to Billy. Rip reserved judgment. He liked the girl's looks. Moreover, he noticed that she spent as much time as she could with Harvey Little, who was a square-faced, grinning kid, and it seemed to Rip that a stuck-up girl would have dodged the company of an ordinary cowpuncher. Rip had already learned that Sunday was just another day on the triple dot. The work went right on, rain or shine, Sunday or Monday. Copeland worked as hard as his men. Rip, listening and watching, was not so sure as he had been that his suspicions were correct. Rip had chosen work with the Granger outfit because he knew that he must have some excuse for being in the country and that he must not attract attention. The role of Granger hand fitted those requirements perfectly. The riders would pay no attention to him as a hay hand, and as the Granger wagon moved around, Rip could look over the country. Most important, Granger hands are usually drifters and talk a lot. With someone like Billy, who knew the country to help in the talking, Rip felt certain that he would hear something that would give him a lead. 3 days after he had arrived at the triple dot, Bart, the merchant of Trinchera, sent 10 more men out to the ranch. The day after that, Bart himself arrived with 2 others, one of whom was a cook. This completed the hay crew, and Gunny had men to boss. He had already put Rip and Billy at work getting mowers and other equipment ready, and now the work stock was brought in and business picked up. Rip, sizing up Bart and the newcomers, thought that he had never seen a harder-looking crew. There was not a man that Bart had brought out that did not look as though he would cut a throat for 2 bits. Bart himself was a long, slender man with black eyes set close together and a long, thin nose above a little tight mouth. Billy had already told Rip that Bart was the big man of Trinchera, that he had a ranch as well as a stair, and that he did what banking business was done in the little town. Rip's opinion of the inhabitants of the Mesa country was lowered considerably when he heard that. Personally, he would not have trusted Bart with a plugged nickel. With the hay crew complete, the mowers and rakes were loaded on wagons, bedrolls were tossed up, the remuda was turned over to Billy to wrangle, and Gunny appeared with a gun strapped to his fat old middle. The drivers took the lines, and with Gunny riding a horse as fat as himself, the outfit pulled out for the first meadow. The first jump was 8 miles. At the end of the drive, camp was set up alongside a hay meadow. That afternoon, the crew began to cut hay. Rip had thought that he was to work on the stacks, but Gunny changed that idea for him. Rip got a mower with a team of fractious horses. More than that, when the remuda had been brought into the rope corral, Gunny had called Rip over, handed him a saddle rope, and ordered him to rope out the horses for the other drivers. Holding his surprise behind his now considerable beard, Rip had obeyed the order. Bumping along on the seat of the mower, Rip cut hay and considered his position. Here he was, right where he had wanted to be. The Canadian was not 12 miles away, and the Horseshoe Mesa with its hard Badlands rim was not over 10 miles distant. Still, he hadn't made any progress in his quest. Rip thought it over. Then he stopped his mower and, oil can in hand, oiled around. If he didn't run into something pretty soon, he decided, he would quit this job, go get his saddle and gear, hire a couple of horses and ride the country. But that was a last resort. Better stay with this job a while, for it had been Copeland's triple dot that Rip had visited when looking for the missing pine tree steers, and the Horseshoe Mesa was on triple dot range. That night at supper, Rip had cause to be pleased with his decision. When dusk was settling, and the men were squatted about the fire eating, Big Cole came riding in to tell Gunny that he was to stay the night. After supper, Cole drew aside a squint-eyed, pockmarked man called Arthur Daly, and the two talked until long after the others had gone to bed. Rip caught none of the conversation. He did watch the two, and when they parted, Rip would have bet that he was on a trail, some kind of trail at least. Morning came, and fortune threw favors in Rip's lap. When the Nighthawk brought in the ramada, There were horses missing. Gunny swore and raved, and ended by calling for Rip. When Rip arrived, Block gave orders. "Listen," said Gunny, "you're no farmer. I seen you rope. Now you take a horse and saddle, and you go find them runaways. And don't you come back till you do. Hear me?" 1 or 2 old saddles had been brought out from the ranch for just such contingencies. Rip secured one of these, took the most likely-looking horse that he could find, and set out, first securing information from the Nighthawk as to where the horses had been held during the night. It was no particular task to find the horses. They had headed back toward the ranch pasture, and Rip found them against the fence. He drove them along with him, back toward camp, and then an idea struck him. Here he was, loose and with time on his hands. He might as well spend the day out here. Rip turned the horses he was driving, and headed for the Horseshoe Mesa. He had never been thoroughly satisfied with his investigation of that mesa. Leaving the horses atop the mesa, he rode to the rim and scouted along the Badlands. He didn't expect to find tracks, didn't expect to find much of anything, but he was reconstructing a happening. 400 head of big 4-year-old pine tree steers had disappeared in this Badlands, and Rip wanted to know how they had done it. He rode along the edge of the Badlands until the rim broke off and stretched down to the hardpan of the river bottom. There he stopped his horse and sat looking out over the country. Down there was the Canadian River, just as he had seen it on that other occasion, and down there bad things happened. Rip leaned forward in his saddle. Down there at the bank of the river was a man. Rip watched him. He saw him skirt along the river, riding aimlessly. He saw him stop and dismount, and then he saw the rider climbing back on his horse falter as his leg crossed the cantle of the saddle. The horse whirled and the rider fell, then flat and faint through the distance, the echo of a shot drifted up to Rip Campbell. The rider's horse trotted a few steps and stopped, looking back, and the man lay flat on the ground by the river. Rip waited. He had not recognized that rider, nor had he seen smoke from the shot. The man lay there, a black mark on the ground. The horse stood a moment with upflung head, then lowered it and moved slowly across the hardpan toward grass and fell to grazing. High in the sky was a black speck, a buzzard. Rip moved his horse toward the slope, and then down the river came another rider, his horse moving as though on business. Rip watched this new arrival, saw him suddenly straighten in his saddle, and the horse break into a lope. Rip saw him slide the horse to a stop, and throw himself out of his saddle, and then saw him bend down over the man on the ground. Then Rip wheeled his mount and rode back. He picked up his strays about where he had left them, and started along toward camp. The things he had seen filled his mind with questions. As he sent the horses down over the slope of the mesa, he wondered who that rider had been, who the second man was. Had the second man shot the first? Rip thought not. He had acted surprised, and he had surely shaken out his horse to get to that prone body. Still, one couldn't be sure. Maybe that was an act. Rip was putting on an act, why not somebody else? Copeland was coming up the river. There was a carbine in the saddle scabbard under the fender of Copeland's saddle. Rip waited. "Strays?" demanded Copeland, coming up and halting his horse. "Yes, sir," said Rip, and did not take his hand from the bib of his overalls. "Mr. Block sent me out to gather them." "Where'd you find them?" Copeland was short. "Over against the mesa," answered Rip. Copeland considered the man. "Gunny says that you're a cowpuncher," he said. Rip cursed the mules and his roping under his breath. "I ain't a puncher," he whined. "I been around ranches some, but I ain't a puncher." Copeland seemed about to say something, and then thought better of it. "I'll help you take them in," he offered. "Thanks," said Rip. The two moved on after the strays. Rip was careful to let himself slump in the saddle, to let his arms move with the trot of his horse. Just a fool Granger in bib overalls, Rip Campbell was. Sure. That was all. From the corners of his eyes, Copeland watched his companion, and Rip did not miss that scrutiny. The crew was cutting hay when Rip and Copeland got in with the strays. Gunny told Rip where the remuda was, and Rip took the horses on out and turned them over to Billy, who was day wrangling. When he came back, Gunny put him on a stack. The hay was coming in pretty fast, and Rip was kept busy. Arthur, also stacking, worked just across from Rip. Copeland and Gunny stood talking together. Rip, building stack carefully, waited for developments. They were not long in coming. A man on a big black horse pulled into the meadow, and behind him, lying across a saddle, was another man. The rider was Herb Hunter, foreman. Rip could see from the top of his stack that the prone bundle lying across the saddle of the second horse was Dusty Summers. Hunter's arrival caused a furor. Men quit work and flocked around. Hunter undid Summers and laid him on the ground. The man was dead, there was no disputing that. Hunter stood over Summers and answered Copeland's questions. Copeland kept his head. He didn't go off, half-cocked. He asked Hunter what had happened, and Rip, who had come down from his stack, listened to the answers. Hunter, so he said, had been riding down the river and had seen a man on the ground and a grazing horse nearby. Riding up and dismounting, he had found Summers, who, shot through the chest, was dying even as Hunter bent over him. The foreman's face was hard as he talked, but not harder than Copeland's rock-like countenance. Rip noticed something, as he listened to the talk, that checked so exactly with what he had seen. There was a rifle lashed on Hunter's saddle. Chapter 4. Copeland issued orders. A hay wagon was unloaded. Dusty Summers' body was loaded on it and taken to the ranch, and from the ranch a message was to go to Trinchera to Scott Davis, the deputy sheriff there. With that attended to, Copeland singled out Rip. "Get yourself a horse," he commanded. "You and Hunter and me will go back down the river and look around." Rip still had his horse in camp. He got the animal, and when he rejoined Wingate and Copeland found them ready to ride. Gunny was with them, expostulating and trying to go along, but Copeland was obdurate. "Somebody's got to stay here and run this outfit," he said. "That's your job." Perforce Gunny stayed, but before the three left, the old foreman came over to Rip. Unbuckling his cartridge belt, he handed it up. "You take this," he said. "She's a hair trigger, now mind." Rip was suffering from a plethora of guns. What with his own and his overall bib, he felt like a walking arsenal. But appearances demanded that he take the weapon, and so, thanking Block, he strapped it on. With Copeland and Wingate, he rode back toward the river. At the river, there was nothing to find or to see. Hunter showed Copeland and Rip the spot where he had found Dusty Summers. There were no tracks on the hardpan, only a dark spot that showed where Summers had bled. Beating along the river bank brought no result. Copeland and Hunter crossed the stream, fording the first channel, emerging on the sandbar and splashing across the second channel. Their search of the opposite bank did not enlighten them, although they covered it carefully. The three spent the remainder of the day along the river, and it was dark when they turned to the hay camp. They left Rip at the camp and rode on to the ranch, telling Gunny that they would be back as soon as the deputy came out from Trinchera, probably early the next morning. Rip, unsaddling his horse, carried his old saddle over to the bed wagon. As he dumped it in beside Gunny's saddle, he noticed a strange saddle in the wagon. Rip managed to knock the blanket from this unfamiliar hull, and climbing up to replace the blanket, made a hasty examination. The saddle was fairly new, and while there was no scabbard on it, there was a rubbed spot on the leather on the underside of the right fender. The rigging showed where straps had held a scabbard in place. Coming back from the wagon to the fire, Rip returned Block's gun. Collecting his supper from the Dutch ovens and frying pans that were close to the blaze, he repaired to a spot well away from the others and ate his meal. As he ate, Billy came over to him. Billy was full of talk and conjecture. He asked questions and gave his ideas as to what had happened. Rip listened. He had already noted that Cole Cook was in camp, and now he asked a question of his own. "Whose cactus is that in the wagon, Billy?" queried Rip. "That's Cole's," answered Billy. "He come in off the mesa while you was out with Copeland." Finishing his supper, Rip dumped his dishes in the dishpan and, rolling a thin smoke, sat down. Billy came over again and wanted to talk, but Rip had pulled back deep into his mind. Rip had seen a man shot that day. He had seen Herb Hunter along the river, and he carried a rifle on his saddle. He had seen Copeland come out of the river bottom, and he too carried a rifle, and he had seen a saddle, Cole Cook's saddle, that showed where a rifle scabbard had been fastened under the fender. Who was it? Copeland, Hunter, Cook, or some unknown? How should he know? Rip asked himself crossly. What business was it of his? He went to bed, still asking himself that question. In the morning, the hay crew went to work. They were almost through with the cutting and stacking at that particular spot. So Rip told himself when he looked at the hay that remained to be cut, they should be through by noon and moving on to another meadow. Rip was on top of his stack, rounding it off, when a little party came to the hay camp. Copeland and Hunter and Scott Davis, the deputy sheriff from Trinchera. Besides those three, there was a buckboard with two men. One of the men Rip recognized as Jake Bart, and he nearly fell off the stack when he got a good look at the other man. There, sitting beside Bart, dressed in bib overalls and a straw hat with brogans on his feet, was Buck Walters, erstwhile rider for the Pine Tree. What in the... Had Goodman sent Walters out on the same mission as Rip? What was Walters doing here? Rip got down from his stack. It was finished anyhow, and there wasn't much more hay to come in. Walking across, he joined Arthur Daly on another unfinished stack and fell to work again. Copeland and the deputy and Hunter were riding out of camp, bound for the scene of the killing. Bart and Walters were talking to Gunny. Gunny nodded, and Walters walked around the buckboard and pulled off a bedroll. So Walters was going to be part of the hay crew. A loaded wagon came up, and Rip was busy again. As Rip had thought, they finished by noon. Rip, joining the rest of the crew at the camp, loaded his plate and ate his dinner. Walters was there. He looked sharply at Rip, but didn't recognize him. Rip's beard covered his face in a rusty stubble. His clothing was dirty and his hat battered. Rip devoutly hoped that Walters didn't know him. Still, he couldn't be sure. When the meal was finished, Gunny gave orders and the camp was loaded. Gunny led the way, and the string of loaded wagons moved off toward the river. It took them all afternoon to make the move, and when they arrived at their destination, they found Hunter waiting for them. Block hailed Hunter, and the foreman answered. Copeland and Davis, Hunter said, had gone back to the ranch. He gave no accounting for his own presence. The new meadow was in the river bottom. The Horseshoe Mesa was 2 miles distant, and the Hardpan Flat perhaps 3 miles. They unloaded, and camp was made beside an old stack yard in which there was still a stack or two standing. The remuda was driven off to graze, Hunter riding out with Billy, and the cook made his fire and began the preparation of supper. Rip, his bed unloaded, looked about for a place to put it. He wasn't going to put it close to Walters, he knew that. Dragging the bed, he stopped close beside the stackyard fence. As he unrolled it, Gunny walked over and stood beside him. "Where'd you find those horses?" he asked curtly. Rip, unthinking, told the truth. "Against the pasture fence at the ranch." Block grunted and walked away. Then suddenly Rip recalled that he had told Copeland that he had found the horses on the mesa. Now Rip wondered what would come of that. When he and Copeland had brought the horses in, they had come up the river, and that was in the direction just opposite from the Triple Dot headquarters. Block was no fool. Rip, thinking it over, decided that he had certainly spilled his beans. But Block did not come back, and nothing was said. Billy came in alone, having been relieved by the nighthawk, and reported that Hunter had gone on to the ranch. Going to bed well away from the others, Rip undressed and put his gun under his head. There was another gun in the bedroll, the gun Rip had taken from Buck Walters in Denver. Its presence did not make Rip feel any better. If Buck wanted a gun, he could get one, Rip was certain. As far as Walters was concerned, that .41 Frontier Colt was not the only gun in the world. They sold guns in Denver and in a good many other places. Rip lay down in his bed and let the camp get quiet. When all was peaceful, he sat up, dressed silently, and taking his Colt, rolled under the stackyard fence and crawled to a stack. Haystacks made good beds, according to Rip Campbell, particularly when there was an enemy loose in the camp. Rip found some loose hay at the base of a stack, and still crawling, prepared to go to sleep on it. As he settled down, he felt something long and hard under him. An exploring hand divulged its identity. It was a rifle in a saddle scabbard. Rip almost yelled when he felt the cold iron of the gun. Here was the weapon that had dropped Dusty Summers. Rip would have bet on it. Rip restrained himself. This surely was not the time or the place to come out dragging that gun. And it wasn't the place to make a bed either. Rip crawled off his pile of loose hay. He moved a good distance away, settled himself, and tried to stay awake. Maybe somebody would come to get that rifle. Maybe they would come soon. But cutting and stacking hay is hard work. Rip was tired. Try as he might, after he had listened and watched for so long a time, his eyes closed and he dozed. Periodically he would awake, only to doze again. And so Rip did not hear a man come stealing from the camp to the stackyard, nor did he hear him leave. The next morning, Rip got up from his hay pile and crawled over the stackyard fence to go to the fire. Most of the men were still asleep, but the cook was up and so was Gunny. Rip could not avoid Gunny's eyes as he crossed the stackyard fence. Going to the fence from his bed, Rip had made occasion to walk across the loose hay he had first chosen for a sleeping site. Hal's feet told him that the rifle was gone. Rip cursed his drowsiness. Gunny said nothing as Rip came to the fire. As the cook was yelling for wood, Rip took the axe and attacked the woodpile. The other men arose, rubbing the sleep from their eyes and putting on their hats as soon as they sat up. Rip looked around and spotted Walters. Walters was getting dressed, and next to him Dally was getting out of bed, cursing. Hay was cut that morning. At noon, Harvey Little came into the camp and ate dirtier with the crew. Cole had not accompanied the crew on the move from the upper meadow, and Harvey was the first triple-dot rider they had seen since the day before. Accordingly, Little was besieged by questions which he could not answer. Indeed, the tale of Dusty Summers' death and the advent of the deputy from Trinchera were news to Little. He had, he explained, gone back from the ranch to the Bend Line camp Sunday evening. Evidently, Little held down the Bend camp and had just spent Sunday at headquarters. He listened avidly to what was told him, but made very little comment. Gunny did most of the talking, seeming to feel that a cowboy should be talked to by a cowboy, and in the course of the conversation Gunny asked Little about fresh meat. Harvey told the old man that he had butchered a yearling and would bring over a side, but Gunny shook his head. "You'll be back through this evening on your way to camp," he said. "I'll send a man over with you to get the meat." It was left at that, and Little rode away on the horse he was working. The afternoon was abominably hot. The hay cut during the morning had cured sufficiently to rake, and was now being hauled in. Rip and Arthur were stacking, but because of the heat and the thunderheads that were rolling up over the mesa, Gunny had put them on one stack and they were working together. Rip was preoccupied. He had paid scarcely any attention to Little at noon, for when he had put his bed together before dinner, he had found that the .41 Colt he had taken from Walters was gone. That meant that someone had visited his bed during his absence last night. Rip believed that someone to be Walters, but he couldn't be sure. He would have bet that had he been in his bed, he wouldn't have wakened in the morning. But that was conjecture. As far as Walters was concerned, he had made no sign that he knew of Rip or that he was aware of his existence. The racks came into the stack, and their loads were pitched off. Gunny was not getting any more hay down. That meant that he thought it would rain. It also meant that Rip and Dally had plenty of work. Walters and his partner brought a rack up and stopped. The man who had been helping Walters load was driving, and back of the rack Walters leaned on his fork. There was a grin on the driver's face. Rip, hot and sweating, didn't pay much attention to the grin. It might have been well if he had. There can be a good deal of horseplay in a Granger camp, and when there is horseplay it is rough. The driver was grinning because in loading the rack he and Walters had found a 5-foot diamond-back rattler under the shock. Walters had deterred his partner from killing the snake. "We'll load him on," Walters had said. "Then we'll pitch him off to the boys, oil the stack, and have some fun." The other man had agreed. Accordingly, when the load was finished, they had returned for the snake, caught it with a fork, and pitched it up. At the moment, he was on top of the load, caught between the tines of the fork upon which Walters so nonchalantly leaned. Rip was at the front of the stack. The team stopped so that the rear of the wagon was opposite Rip, and Walters gave his fork an extra shove to load the implement, caught the handle well up, and pitched hurriedly. Rip caught a flash of something in the air that was not hay. He heard the buzz of the snake, and stabbed out with his fork to deflect the descending hay. He knew that there was a snake coming down, and he didn't intend to be under it. At the same time Walters yelled, "Look out, snake!" Arthur, further back on the stack, sprang forward. Rip had sent the forkful of hay and the snake toward the side of the stack with his hurried lunge. The hay, always slippery underfoot, slid with him, and he went down, losing his fork as he fell. Dally, his fork uplifted, was lunging forward. Rip's astonished eyes read murder in Daly's face. There was no time to think of snakes now. Rattlers are bad enough, but they are not quite as certain as a 5-tined fork driven by a brawny arm. Rip tried to roll, and again hay slid and Rip was cascading with it over the edge of the stack, while Dally, unable to stop his lunge, brought his fork down into the spot where Rip had lain. Over on the wagon, Walters and his partner were laughing at the confusion they had caused. The snake slid off the edge of the stack. A man coming in with another rack of hay had halted his team, leapt down and killed it. Rip, hitting the ground, found his leg bent under him. He was scarcely able to rise. Gunny was running into the stackyard, swearing. It didn't take Gunny long to read the riot act to Walters and the other man on the rack. Hal's talk was short and to the point. Another stunt like that, vowed Gunny, and the two would be walking to Trinchera. In the meantime, Dally had come down from the stack and was helping Rip to his feet. "I sure tried to get that rattler before he got to you," said Dally earnestly. "Hell, he was 6 foot long, it looked like. That was a fine joke to play, pitching a snake up on the stack. If he'd have bit you, it would have been so long and no mistake." The man spoke so earnestly, seemed so sincere, that Rip almost believed him. Still, he had seen Daly's face and the uplifted fork. He had seen those bright tines flash down even as Rip slid from the stack. Dally was helping Rip up and brushing him off. Rip could hardly accuse him of attempted murder. The incident had been a practical joke and an accident to all appearances. Rip could not be sure that it wasn't. When Gunny came around the stack, Rip was limping over to pick up his fork, and apparently the whole thing was over. "I told them, too, that I'd fire them if they tried another stunt like that," said Gunny. "Now you drop it. Don't you go jump them. You understand me?" He jabbed out a finger. Rip made no reply. Limping over to the stack, he stuck his fork in the side, preparatory to climbing to the top. Dally was already on the top and holding out his hand to help Rip. Gunny watched his man anxiously as Rip went up. He didn't want trouble in the hay crew, but unless he was mistaken, this Rip boy wasn't going to drop the matter as it stood. In fact, Gunny would have been disappointed if Rip had dropped the matter. Rip Campbell had become a favorite with the fat little boss of the Granger wagon. The crew managed to finish the stack before the rain began. With the rainfall, haying came to a standstill and the crew went to camp. Rip was slow in getting in because of his lame leg. When he did arrive, he found Walters and Daly under a wagon with some others. The men with Walters were chuckling over something, and as Rip limped up, the laughter ceased. Rip squatted down so that he could look under the wagon, the rain dripping from his straw hat and beating soddenly on his shoulders. "No more snakes," he said quietly, looking Walters in the eye. "Try it another way next time, and be sure you make a job of it." Walters' face paled a little under Rip's stare. Then he turned to the man who sat beside him and spoke. Rip, his warning issued, had straightened and was limping toward his bed. The camp was miserable in the rain. The wind blew gusts across the campsite. The men got under wagons or sought what shelter they could find, there to wait out at the storm, pull their wet clothing away from their bodies, and roll cigarettes with moist fingers. Under the canvas fly that he had rigged for a sunshade, the cook was busy, moving around the fire, trying to get away from the smoke that seemed to follow wherever he went, swearing at the weather and at wet wood that refused to burn. Rip, under the shelter of a rack, sat and sucked at his damp smoke and stared out at the scene, while under the bed wagon Daly spoke to Walters, for the two were now alone. "He's slippery as an eel," said Daly. "I was sure I had him with the fork, but he rolled off the edge of the stack." "Why didn't you say you was going to bring in a snake and throw it up?" "Because I didn't know I was going to," answered Walters. "It was just a chance. If you'd got him with the fork." Hal's voice trailed off. "What did Bart say?" demanded Daly. "When's he coming out?" "As soon as he gets the money for the steers," answered Walters. "And he's got something on his mind besides that. We won't be pitching hay for long, Arthur." "It was a fool idea to do it at all, if you ask me," returned Daly irritably. "Why didn't Bart let us go to his place and hole up? Why did he want us out here working like dogs?" "I don't know." Walters looked across to the wagon, under which Rip sat. "Bart's deep. There ain't nobody going to be looking hard at a Granger crew, and men can drift in and out. It gives a man an excuse to be in the country. Bart's got something up his sleeve. He's slick. Have you heard Gunny say anything?" "Not a word." "Well," Walters shrugged, "he'll talk before long or I miss my guess. Arthur, that son of a whore over there under that wagon is dangerous. I told Bart he was when I seen him here, and Bart just grunted. We made 2 tries at him last night and today. I found the gun he took off me in Denver in his bedroll. I took it." "That was a fool thing to do," grated Daly. "Now he'll be looking out." "He won't look out long," vowed Walters. "Next time, I ain't going to be joking." Daly squinted meditatively. "Maybe there won't be a next time," he said. "I wish I had my money from them steers and was out of here." Chapter 5. The rain held. Not a hard, vicious rain, but a steady downpour. About 6 o'clock, when the cook had supper ready, Harvey Little, covered with a slicker, came into the hay camp. He ate with the crew under the cook's tent, sitting well out because, as he said, a little more rain ain't going to make much difference to this slicker. When the meal was over, Little said that he had to get along to camp, and again volunteered to bring over the side of beef. Gunny was about to accept the offer when Rip interposed. "I got a poncho in my bed, Mr. Block," he said. "I don't mind riding over and bringing back a quarter." Gunny looked at Rip, shrugged, seemed about to veto the suggestion, then changed his mind. "All right," he said. "You can go if you want to. The horses will be in a minute." Gunny's prediction was correct. Within a short time, Billy brought the horses in and threw them into the rope corral. Harvey, his rope wet and stiff, managed to catch a horse for Rip and stood by while he got the poncho from his bedding and saddled. Then the two rode away, Rip to return in the morning with the beef. The two talked little on the way to the camp. It was quite a piece down the river, across the hardpan. The rain beat on them steadily, and Rip, already wet through, rode in silence. It was dark by the time the two had crossed the hardpan, and Little, turning in his saddle, said cheerily, "Not much further now. I'll bet that you'll be plenty glad to dry out." Rip nodded and followed Little toward camp, 2 buildings, a house and a shed. "You go on to the house," said Little. "I'll throw the horses in the barn." Rip waited for him in the shelter of a small porch made from the overhang of the eaves. When they opened the door, the room appeared deserted. A lamp burned on a table, and another darkened door told of a room beyond. Little closed the door behind them and turned again to his companion. Little grunted. "Somebody holed up in the camp." "Somebody's been here sure enough," said. "Well, it won't make any difference," he said. Went off and left the light burning. "There's 3 beds anyhow. And they'll be in." "Why?" There was surprise in his voice. Rip, turning, followed Little's eyes. The youngster was looking at a rifle in a sheath that stood in a corner. "What's the matter?" asked Rip. "My carbine," said Little. "Somebody taken it a month ago, and here it is." Laughter swallowed the rest of his words. 2 girls, one dark, the other fair, came bubbling with laughter from the dark door of the other room. Charlotte Copeland and Beryl White. "Surprise! Surprise!" called Charlotte. Indeed, it was a surprise. Harvey Little recoiled a step, and a grin widened on his face. "Well, what in the world?" he began. "Beryl and I went out for a ride," explained Charlotte. "We rode up on the mesa, and I said it would be fun if we came down to see you. So we did, and the rain caught us. We're going to stay all night. You'll have to sleep in the barn." "But your dad," expostulated Harvey. "What'll he say, and what'll your mother think?" "Dad and Mother have gone to Trinchera, and won't be back till tomorrow," answered Charlotte. "And it will be perfectly proper, anyway. I'll chaperone Beryl, and she can chaperone me." There were more arguments on the tip of Harvey's tongue, but he stilled them. Rip, looking at the boy, could see eagerness and perhaps longing in his eyes. Harvey Little was in love with Charlotte Copeland. Rip would have bet his saddle on that. And looking at the girl, he wasn't at all sure that she was not in love with Little. It was then that Harvey thought of his guest. Gravely and courteously, he introduced Rip. The girls nodded. Rip said that he was pleased to meet them. Both men now stripped off their raincoats, Rip putting his poncho on a hook and Harvey hanging his slicker beside it. The girls had built a fire in the little sheet iron stove, and Rip, standing beside the stove, turned his body until first one side and then the other side of his clothing steamed. The conversation in the shack was lively. Rip was disregarded, left out, but that suited him. Harvey was chided for not being at home when his guests arrived. There were jokes made at his expense, and he was kidded unmercifully, all of which he seemed to enjoy. Later, the talk took a more serious tone. "Beryl's going back to school with me next year," announced Charlotte. "Her mother sold her brand, and now she can go." "Your mother sold the cross in a box?" asked Harvey. "I thought she'd keep that." Beryl White laughed. "She sold it," she said. "I thought that she'd keep it too. I didn't think anyone would buy it. But the buyer wanted it for some reason or other, and he gave Mama $600 for the brand and what cattle there were." Little was frowning. "There wasn't more than 8 or 10 head of cross in a box left," he said. $600 seems mighty big money for that." "Maybe he wanted to send Beryl to school to get her out of the way," laughed Charlotte. "Mr. Bart has been mighty attentive to Mrs. White, you know, in the last few months." "Charlotte," said Beryl indignantly, and both Charlotte and Little laughed. The talk went on. Generalities, mention of dances past and in the future, one thing and another. Rip yawned. After all, he had had a hard day. That yawn brought the others to a realization of the time. Harvey said goodnight to the girls, told Rip to come with him, and the two men, donning their raincoats again and taking a lantern, went out to bed down in the barn. There, as they made ready for the night, Rip asked a question. "That cross in a box brand," he said. "How's it put on?" There was dust on the board floor of the barn loft where the two were standing, and Little bent down and drew a diagram in the dust. "Like this," he said. "On the right hip. I'm going back to the house a minute. There's something I forgot." Leaving the lantern, he went down the ladder from the loft. Rip bent over the pattern, traced in the dust. "So," drawled Rip Campbell softly. "Like that on the right hip." Beside the pattern Little had traced, Rip drew another, and then, staring at the two, a third. He looked down at them, cross in a box, triple dot and pine tree. "I'd kind of like to have a brand like that myself," said Rip softly. "Anyhow in this country." Little returned from the house with 2 blankets, one of which he tossed to Rip. There was a faraway, bright look in Harvey's eyes. His hat was pushed back and there was rain on his cheeks. Rip grinned. A man doesn't walk in the rain with his hat pushed back, unless he is considerably perturbed. Rip had reason to believe that Harvey had not gone back to the house solely for the blankets. Both men undressed. Rip hung his still damp clothes over a rafter where they might dry somewhat. Wrapping themselves in the 2 blankets, the 2 men lay down on the musty hay, and Little blew out the light. A call from outside awakened Rip. Someone was calling. "Little! Little!" and the rain was still dripping soddenly on the roof. It was still dark, so black in the loft that Rip could not see his hand when he reached out of his blankets. A match flamed, and Little touched the flame to the lantern wick. "What is it?" called Harvey. The voice came again from outside. "This is Hunter. Put on your clothes and come down here." By lantern light, the 2 in the loft hurriedly dressed. Then, with Poncho covering Rip and Slicker covering Harvey, the 2 went down the ladder and out of the barn. There was a light in the house showing that the girls were up, and in front of the barn there were 3 men on horses. As the lantern light reflected wetly frothed the group, Rip recognized Hunter, Gunny, and Scott Davis, the deputy from Trinchera. "What's up, Hunter?" asked Little. It was Davis that answered that question. "Come on in the house, Harvey," said Davis solemnly. "We want to talk to you." In the house, the girls showed their frightened faces through the bedroom door. Davis was uneasy. He glanced at the girls, back to Little, and then at the lamp on the table. "Where were you day before yesterday, Harvey?" asked Davis. "Why?" Little considered the question. "I rode below here that day, Scott. Rode bog along the river." "What's the matter?" Davis walked over and picked up the carbine that stood sheathed in a corner of the room. "Your gun?" he asked, looking at Little. Harvey nodded. "Funny too," he said. "That gun's been gone for a month, pretty near. Then when Rip and me come in this evening, it was standing there in the corner. What's this all about?" "It's all about this," said Davis. "Dusty Summers was killed day before yesterday. Somebody bushwhacked him out on the hard pan. And you come down here asking me about it?" Little's voice was level. Davis brought a spent shell from his pocket. Slowly he slid the carbine from its sheath, and opening the breech, lifted the gun until he looked down the barrel at the light. "It's fouled," he said to no one in particular. "I done more than come down to ask you, Harvey. I'm going to take you back with me in the morning. Back to Trinchera. You see, you bought the last box of UMC cartridges that Bart had at his store, and," he paused, "this shell was found in the willows by the hardpan. It's the shell that killed Summers, and it's a UMC." He held out the bit of metal. "But that gun was stolen, I tell you," exclaimed Little. "It was just brought back tonight." "Hell, Davis, you think I killed Summers?" "Why would I want to kill him?" "I don't know," said Davis slowly. "Summers was a stock detective that the association sent in here. We looked at his papers. I don't know why you'd want to kill him, but your gun's been shot, and it's got UMC shells in it, and Summers was killed with a UMC. I'm going to take you in. I tell you that the gun was taken, reiterated Little. It was just brought back tonight. Why, Davis? Hunter interrupted. That's an old stall, Little, he said gruffly, but he was grinning. Harvey Little wheeled and faced the foreman. So it was you that brought Scott out, he said. I didn't think you'd go that far with it, Hunter. I sure didn't. Hunter opened his mouth to speak, his face flushing angrily. Then he thought better of the idea and closed his mouth again. There was something between Hunter and Little, Rip saw. He wondered what it was. Hal's eyes followed Hunter's look, and Rip saw that the triple dot foreman was watching the girls in the doorway. So that was it. Hunter was in love with Charlotte Copeland, and he was getting rid of Little's competition. Gunny shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He, too, was looking at the door. We'd better make some coffee, said Gunny. You girls get dressed and come on out here. Charlotte, you ought to be spanked, running off from home this way. We were caught by the rain, Charlotte said defensively, glaring at Herb. Well, said Gunny, you go get dressed now. It seemed as though morning would never come. The men sat around the little room. Gunny squatting beside Rip, who in turn squatted against the wall. Davis tried to get Little to talk, but Little had shut up like a clam. He simply stared at Hunter, and Hunter could not abide that stare. The triple dot foreman moved uneasily around the room and talked to Gunny and to Davis. The girls, dressed, had come from the bedroom, and Charlotte had walked defiantly over and seated herself beside Little. When morning finally came, Hunter went out to look after the horses while Gunny prepared a meager breakfast. Rip went out when Hunter departed, and he watched the foreman ride out into the horse pasture after mounts. Hunter, Rip noticed, did not have a rifle CM his saddle. When breakfast was finished, Little, under Davis's supervision, put a few possessions in his war sack for the ride into Trinchera. We might as well go, said the deputy. They filed out of the house. Rip, not forgetting his errand, went to the meat safe back of the house. Gunny accompanying him. There was a fresh beef in the meat safe, a small beef that had been split. They quartered the meat and, finding sacks, wrapped the quarters and carried them around the house to where the horses were tied. You might as well take one of these, Harvey, said Gunny. And you can take one, Herb. Accordingly, with Block, Rip, Little, and Hunter each carrying a quarter of beef on the saddle, the little procession started. The rain had stopped, and the morning was bright. Chapter 6. When the little party of horsemen came to the hardpan, Rip noticed a string of cattle coming down from the mesa. Cattle going to water. Hunter, who rode beside Rip, also saw the cattle. I want to look at that bunch, he said. Take the meat. When he reached the cattle, they were almost at the river. They lined up along the riverbank, drinking, and Hunter waited. The others drew closer, and then turned a little toward the mesa. The river was high because of the rain. Wingate, when the cattle had drunk, separated 3 cows from the others and pushed them into the channel. The cattle swam, quartering across the stream and heading toward the sandbar that barely showed because of the high water. The animals went downstream a long distance and then emerged on the bar and stood there, water lapping at their feet. Then a cow stepped off into the other channel and pushed across, and the other 2 followed her. Hunter came loping back. Bart's cattle, he explained. I shoved them over to his side of the river. Rip was silent. A great light had suddenly dawned upon the young rider. So that was where the pine tree steers had gone. Rip cursed himself for a simpleton. Of course. The pine trees had run. They had split up against the mesa, and the bunch that had gone toward the Badlands had been picked up by the riders who were waiting for them. It was as simple as that. The riders had held the steers on the Badlands, and driven them down the slope to the hardpan. No tracks on the Badlands. It was too hard, so hard that not even a shod horse would leave much sign. Then, when the Badlands broke into the hardpan, the riders had again held the steers close. No tracks on the hardpan either. The hardpan went into the river, and by working in the shallow water at the edge of the canyon, the thieves had held the cattle in the water and drifted them downstream, out to the sandbar and on across. Naturally, the steers had spread out and come out of the water singly and a long distance downstream. No wonder that the pine tree riders had sworn that those 400 head of big steers had sprouted wings. There just hadn't been any chance for a slip. The question of how the steers had gone was answered. But there were other questions. Somebody had started the pine tree herd to running. Someone who was hooked up in this country, who knew that there were riders waiting to take advantage of the run, who knew the country, and someone who had been at the herd when it ran. That left 3 people, Chuck Blossom, Whit Anders, and Walters. Chuck Blossom was either in Denver or on the trail back to San Angelo. Chuck was out. Walters was working at the Triple Dot Granger wagon, and Whit Anders was missing. Whit had gone to the herd that night. Rip had heard him leave camp, and Whit had picked the bed ground. Maybe Whit was the man. But here was Walters, dressed up like a Granger and chummy with Arthur Daly, and Walters and Daly had tried to kill Rip. That snake business had been no accident. Walters' gun was gone too. Rip stared straight ahead and forgot to ride like a farmer. He was too busy thinking of other things. When the riders reached the hay camp, Hunter had a surprise for Gunny. "I'm going to be short-handed," he said abruptly. "Summers is dead. Little is going to jail, and Cole Cook quit yesterday. I want to take a man of yours, Gunny." "Cook quit," said Block. "How come?" "Went to work for Bart," said Wingate. "Bart's moving some stuff. I'd like to have Billy." "Well, I'll be derned," announced Gunny. "Billy? Of all the—" "He's been wanting to work for me a long time," interrupted Hunter. "I'm going to try him out. I can always fire him, you know. Send out for him, will you?" There was nothing for Gunny to do but give in. The cow work came first, and the cow boss clearly superseded the Granger foreman. Gunny looked around. "You go out to the cavvy and send Billy in," he said sourly to Rip. "You can wrangle horses, I reckon." Rip nodded, and mounting his horse, rode out of camp. The cavvy was a mile down the river. Rip and Gunny had seen the horses as they rode toward camp. Rip found Billy and gave him the message. Billy grinned, thanked Rip, and started his horse toward the hay camp. Before he had gone 10 feet, he had the horse at a lope. Left alone with the remuda, Rip rolled a cigarette and squinted an eye at the sky. So Cole Cook was working for Bart. Cocking one leg over the horn of his saddle, Rip pondered. Mentally, he came at length to what had occurred that morning. Hunter shoving the cattle into the river. The river had been up, and Rip wondered why Hunter had put the cattle across the stream, swollen as it was. He hadn't seen the brands on those cattle. Maybe Hunter hadn't wanted anyone to see them. Rip wished that he might see the crossing again. Why shouldn't he? He was free from camp, and certainly the horses were mobile. It wasn't far to the hardpan, not more than 2 miles. Rip put his loose foot back in the stirrup and, circling his horses, started them toward the river. At the edge of the hardpan, he left the cavvy and rode on. The horses would work back toward camp, he knew, and they wouldn't leave the bottom. It would be no trick to pick them up as he returned. Out on the hardpan, he stopped and tried to find where the cattle Hunter had driven had entered the river. He couldn't find the place. The water was going down rapidly, and was not nearly so high as it had been. Rip looked out and saw the top of the sandbar, and on the sandbar was a black object. Probably a snag washed down by the high water and stranded on the bar. Still, it might be something else. Curiosity prompted Rip. He kicked his horse off into the channel. The channel was deep, and the horse had to swim a few yards. The water grew shallow again, and Rip splashed along. He reached the sandbar, and with his pony's feet sinking into the soft sand, rode 100 yards downstream. Hal's eyes widened, and his face grew white beneath its tan. There, emerging from the sand, was the arm and shoulder of a man. For a little time, Rip sat and looked at the thing he had found. Then, dismounting, he kicked at the wet sand until the shoulder and neck and head of the body were exposed. The face was bloated, swollen out of all recognition, but there was no mistaking the clothing. The brown neckerchief and the gray shirt with a little notebook, pulp now, protruding from the pocket. This was Whit Anders. No question now as to who had started the cattle on their run. No question now at all. Rip looked back toward the hay camp, invisible some 3 miles up the river. "Damn you," he almost yelled. After a few moments, he brought himself back to facts. He couldn't leave the body where it was. Another rise in the stream might send it miles away with the current. How should he dispose of it? There was a saddle rope on the saddle, and Rip uncoiled it and fastened the loop about that rigid arm. Then, mounting, he set his horse back, and the body came out of the sand with a sucking, sickening sound. Towing all that remained of Whit Anders, Rip started back toward the hardpan. He slid it over the hardpan until he reached the mesa. There, among the broken badland rock, he freed the rope and piled the rough chunks of lava over Whit Anders. He bowed his head and sent a silent prayer toward the blue sky for his fallen friend. Rip mounted again and started back upriver. When he reached the edge of the hardpan, found a grazing horse. The sight of the animal restored some sanity to Rip. He could not ride back to the hay camp, call Walters out, and invite him to defend himself. That would not do. Rip had no doubt that Walters had killed Whit Anders, but there had been other men with Walters, and behind him was a cunning brain that had planned it all. Rip was sure of that too. Gradually, his flaming anger subsided into a cold, hard rage. Hal's mind was ice-cold and ice-hard. He would find the man who was behind it all, the man who had planned the theft and who profited most by it. That man would pay, and then he, Rip, would collect justice from Walters. Rip swung his mount to pick up the grazing horse, and driving the animal, headed toward the others of the loosely scattered remuda. With the bell on an old gray mare tinkling, Rip drove the cavvy back up the river. Toward noon, when the sun was high overhead, Gunny came out for Rip. The hay had dried enough to cut, and he wanted the horses brought in. The two hazed the remuda toward camp and threw the horses into the rope corral. Smoke went straight up from the fire, and the men of the crew were eating dinner. Rip went over and joined them. While they ate, the cook talked to Gunny, and when the meal was done, Block came over to Rip. "Get a team for Cookie to drive to the ranch this evening," he said shortly. "He needs some grub." Rip nodded. Rising, he put his plate and cup in the dishpan and walked over to get his horse. He still limped a little from his fall from the stack. Hal's path led him close to where Walters and Dally were sitting. As Rip passed, Walters, a grin on his face, pursed his lips and buzzed. The sound was almost that of a snake, and Rip wheeled. As he looked down at Walters, his rage overcame him. One strong brown hand reached down and seized Walters' shoulder. Rip jerked the man to his feet and flung him away. Walters recovered his balance. "Damn you," he roared and leapt at Rip. If Walters had tried for his gun, Rip would have killed him in that instant. But Walters did not try. Hal's fists were swinging as he leapt in, and one big fist struck Rip's head and made him reel. In another instant, the two were clenched, and Walters was bringing up a knee at Rip's groin. Rip, recovering from the blow, arched his back, and the blow did not go home. Rip's left hand was sunk in Walters' neck, and his right swung short, chopping blows that spatted viciously. Then those chopping blows ceased. The right hand joined at Walters' throat and stayed there. Clawing, kicking, swinging futile blows, Walters tried to break that grip, but the hands clung leech-like. Walters' struggles weakened. Gradually he bent back until at length his knees gave way, and he fell, his purpling face turned up to the sky. Rip, his face contorted, sank his fingers deeper and deeper into the man's relaxing throat. It was Gunny who stopped Rip. Gunny who caught his arms and sent Rip rolling from Walters. Rip scrambled to his feet. Hal's eyes were still dark with rage. "Stop," snapped Gunny. "Stop." Gradually, the red veil lifted from Rip's eyes, and he could see the men and the camp again. Daly stood with his hand under the bib of his overalls. Walters was on the ground, his mouth open and his chest heaving as he struggled for breath. Gunny stood, legs spread apart, facing Rip. "Because a man buzzes at you like a snake is no sign you got to kill him," he snapped. "You're through. You can go to the ranch with Cookie this evening. Maybe Copeland will send you in from there." Rip nodded dully. The rage was running out of him in a flood. He felt weak. Daly took his hand from the bib of his overalls and walked to where Walters lay. Bending down, he lifted the man so that Walters could breathe more easily. "Get your bedding and put it in the wagon," Block ordered Rip. "I'll give you a note to Copeland, and he'll pay you." Rip, collecting himself, walked over to where his bed lay and slowly began to put it together. Chapter 7. Half an hour later, bearing a note to Copeland, Rip rode out of the hay camp sitting beside the cook on the spring seat of the wagon. Billy's Cosgrove's bedding bumped beside Rip's bedroll in the back of the wagon. He was, Rip decided, well content to go. There was not much more that he could do with the Granger wagon. Now Rip felt he needed to be free. He must inform Davis in Trinchera of the discovery of Whit Andrews' body. Also, he must write of that discovery to Hal Goodman. He would send 2 letters, Rip decided, one to Denver and one to San Angelo. He would be sure to catch Goodman at one place or the other. The cook was smoking a pipe. The strong fumes of the tobacco crinkled Rip's nostrils, and in self-defense he reached for his own makings. As he rolled his smoke, the cook spoke. "You been a rider, ain't you?" said the cook. "What makes you think so?" "I been one," answered the cook. "You aimed to kill that man you was fighting." "Maybe." The cook puffed twice, spat and eyed. "Too bad." "What?" asked Rip. "Too bad you didn't." The cook spat again. Rip thought that over. He waited for the cook to continue, but the cook had pumped his well dry. Gradually, Rip retired into his own mind. Grimly there, he ticked off facts. First, he knew where the steers had gone. They had gone across the river. He knew who had killed Whit Andrews. Walters. He knew, too, who had handled the steers, or at least he believed he knew. The brands that he had drawn in the dust on the barn floor were pretty good proof to Rip that Jake Bart was the man who handled the cattle. Jake Bart had bought the cross in a box, and the pine tree could be run into a dandy cross in a box. Here Rip scowled. The brands were enough evidence to Rip, but they might not be to anyone else. Save for getting the pine tree steers or collecting for them, Rip's job was done, and yet, somehow, he didn't feel that it was done. A sentimental fool, Rip told himself. Just a crying old woman. But Little was in jail in Trinchera, and Charlotte loved Harvey. Rip liked Harvey himself. And Dusty Summers had been killed, and there was a confusion of rifles around the Granger camp. With a start, Rip recalled that Hunter had not been carrying a rifle on his saddle that morning, whereas he had been sure when Rip had first seen him. "Might as well see the thing through," he said to himself, the words small in his mouth. "What's that?" demanded the cook. "Nothing," said Rip Campbell. When the two arrived at the Triple Dot, the cook halted the wagon in the yard, and both men got down from the seat. As they started toward the house, the door was flung violently open and Charlotte came out. She flung herself across the porch and down the steps, and turned to face Copeland, who had appeared in the doorway. "I don't care what you say," said the girl angrily, flinging the words at her father. "I'm going to Trinchera, and I'm going to marry Harvey. He didn't do it. What would he shoot a man for? He hasn't been stealing your cattle. Come back here, commanded Copeland, his face red with anger. But the girl was striding off, away from the house. Rip coughed, and Copeland, turning his head, saw the two men for the first time. What do you want? The cook spat. I came in for some grub, he said laconically. I reckon I'll go to the cook shack. He turned and limped away. Well, said Copeland, staring at Rip. Block sent me in for my time, said Rip. Here's a note. Copeland took the piece of paper that Rip extended and glanced at it. Fighting, huh? He snapped. I've a good mind to take it out of you. You Grangers think you can come in and raise hob with a man's outfit. Copeland was mad, Rip realized, but Rip himself was not in the best of temper. You got a sight better mind to set down and write out my time, he drawled. Hot black eyes met eyes with golden flecks in them, and Copeland was the first to look away. I'm kind of sore, he said apologetically. You go on to the bunkhouse and stay for the night. I'll take you into town in the morning. I got something else to look after right now. With that, he came down from the porch and, taking the same direction that Charlotte had taken, hurried away. Rip walked to the wagon, got his bed, and went on to the bunkhouse. Instead of going around to the old rock building, he entered the new cabin that the riders used. There he dumped his bed on the floor, and walking over to the packing box, sat down. About 5 o'clock, the Triple Dot riders began to come in. Billy was the first to arrive. He still wore shoes and bib overalls, but he swaggered when he came through the door and hailed Rip. Rip answered the greeting, and when they had talked a few moments, got up and went out. When he returned, Billy had his bed unrolled. Rip went back to his box and sat down. Hal's roving eyes fixed on a scabbarded rifle standing in a corner, and rising, Rip walked over and picked up the gun. It hadn't been there when he had left. Nice gun, he said to Billy. Whose is it? Hunter's, said Billy, a tinge of uneasiness in his voice. Why? Don't see many 44-40s anymore, answered Rip, sliding the weapon out of the scabbard. I always liked them. Hunter's touchy about his gun, said Billy. Better put it up. Rip returned the weapon to the scab bard and set it back in the corner. Further talk was cut off by the arrival of other riders. They took Rip's presents silently, saying nothing. One by one they came in, Hunter the last to arrive, and when they were all in, the cook called them to supper. When Rip left the bunkhouse, he noted that the hay camp cook had left with the wagon. Rip took his place at the table, saying nothing to the others, ate his food, and after the meal stepped back over the bench and went outside. There, while he rolled a smoke, Hunter came up to him. Quit gunny, Rip, he answered. Fired, Rip answered. Hunter paused a moment, and then spoke again. Bart will be cutting hay now, he said. You might get on with him. Thanks. Rip strolled away. Billy was at the corner of the bunkhouse, and Rip joined him there. Apparently, some of the taint of the Granger still clung to Billy, for the other riders left him alone. The two were by themselves, and Rip, squatting on a heel, looked up at the young fellow. Billy, he drawled, when did you bring Hunter's rifle into the ranch? Billy was caught unprepared by the question. This morn, he began, and then he said, I didn't bring Hunter's rifle in. Don't lie. There's hay in the scabbard of that rifle. It was hid in the old stack at the hay camp. I felt it the night we moved in there. You got it out of that stack. Hunter told you to. You put it in your bed, and when we brought your bed in, you unloaded it and put it in the corner. What if I did? Snapped Billy. Nothing, drawled Rip softly. It just makes you accessory to murder, that's all. They hang a man for that out here. Billy's gasp told Rip that the words had gone home. You keep your mouth shut and say nothing, and I'll keep mine shut, said Rip. I ain't talking. But if you tell Hunter, I won't tell nobody, Billy said earnestly. I sure won't. You'd be a fool if you did. Rip got up. Good night, he said, his voice kindly. Sleep good. Rip was grinning as he walked away. He could imagine how well Billy would sleep. The boy wouldn't sleep at all, unless Rip was mistaken. Well, that couldn't be helped. Rip had the information that he wanted. It looked to Rip very much as though Hunter was the man that had killed Dusty Summers. Rip slept with the others in the bunkhouse that night, and while Billy tossed and turned the night through, Rip lay quietly awake, thinking. In the morning, after breakfast, Copeland came out and told Rip that he would leave for town shortly. When the buckboard stopped at the bunkhouse for Rip and his bedroll, Copeland, face stern, was occupying the seat beside Charlotte. The girl was subdued, and in her eyes showed signs of weeping. Rip loaded his bed, climbed in the back. Copeland started the team moving. For the first few miles there was silence on the seat of the buckboard, and then Copeland spoke. I'm not going Harvey's bond because you're in love with him, Charlotte, he said gravely. I'm going it because no man can say that I ever let a man of mine down. Davis says. Davis is Bart's man, snapped the girl. I wouldn't believe him any more than I'd believe Bart. You know yourself that you told Mother and me that you thought he wasn't honest. You were. I know nothing of Bart's honesty, said Copeland. I do know that when he bought the cross in a box brand from Mrs. White, he laid himself open to suspicion. I've written to Denver and to Pueblo and other points to see if there have been cross in a box cattle marketed. If I find that there have been, then I'll talk to him. There were only a few heads of cross in a box cattle, and Alan White stopped using that brand before he died. Now I've told you more than I meant, Charlotte. Apparently, Copeland recalled Rip's presence for the first time. He looked back over his shoulder. Rip had closed his eyes when Copeland stopped talking. To all appearances, he was asleep. So Copeland had seen what could be done with a cross in a box brand, had he? That accounted for the presence of Dusty Summers on the triple dot. Well, he'd show Copeland something else that could be done with a cross in a box. Then the thought flashed into Rip's mind that Copeland had written for information to Pueblo and to Denver. That information might be valuable to Copeland, but it would be doubly valuable to Rip. He must disclose his identity to get that information. But he wasn't ready right now to say just who he was. When the buckboard reached Trinchera and stopped before Bart's store, Copeland got down and shook Rip's shoulder. Rip, yawning, seemed to waken. I'll pay you off, said Copeland curtly. Here. He brought bills from his pocket, and detaching several, held them out. Here's your wages, he said. Rip took the money, said thanks gruffly, and then asked, You going to be in town long, Copeland? I don't know, answered Copeland. I won't leave before noon. Why? I'll maybe try to get another job, answered Rip, and I'd like to have you for a reference. Copeland grunted at that, and turning, walked up the street toward a small cottage before which hung a little sign. The sign read, L. M. Higley, M.D. and Justice of the Peace. Charlotte was already standing at the gate, below the sign. Rip watched Copeland join his daughter, and saw the two walk to the cottage. When Copeland and Charlotte had disappeared into the cottage, Rip turned. There was a barber shop half a block down the street. Rip walked over. Inside the little building, the barber quit a game of dominoes and stepped behind his chair. Rip shook his head. Bath first, he said, then I'll get the works, haircut and shave. Say, I got 2 bundles down in Bart's warehouse. What's the chances of getting one of you to bring them here? Coins clinked suggestively in Rip's pocket as he spoke. I'll go get them, an idle loafer said eagerly. You got a check or something for them? Rip held out 2 small pieces of pasteboard and a silver dollar. That'll be fine, he said. Here's the stubs off the tags. You bring them here. The bathroom's in the back, said the barber. There's clean towels inside. And that will be fine too, said Rip, moving toward the door the barber had indicated. Just throw that canvas sack inside when you get it here. The idler nodded, and Rip, stepping through, closed the bathroom door. An hour and 15 minutes later, Rip emerged from the barber shop. Rip, the Granger hand, had gone in. Rip Campbell, bright-eyed, clean-shaven, his locks trimmed, stepped out. "I'll leave my saddle here a while," he said to the barber, and the barber, his eyes still wide at the metamorphosis, nodded. Boots kicking up little clouds of dust, Rip went up the street. When he came to Bart's store, he hesitated. Copeland's buckboard was still standing in front of the store. Rip turned to enter, and at that moment Copeland, accompanied by Charlotte and Little, came out. The girl's hand was tucked possessively through Little's arm, and she was smiling, but Copeland's face wore a frown. "Mr. Copeland," said Rip Campbell. Copeland turned. For a moment, he did not recognize the speaker. Then his lips parted, and his eyes widened. "You," he began. "I'd like to talk to you a minute," said Rip. He stepped aside, and Copeland, surprise still written in his eyes, followed. Little and the girl stared at Rip, their faces puzzled. Rip pulled an envelope from his pocket and tendered it to Copeland. "Read that," he said. Copeland drew a paper from an envelope and, unfolding it, read, "To those concerned, the bearer is Rip Campbell, employed by the Pine Tree brand of San Angelo, Texas. Any assistance rendered him by peace officers or others will be appreciated. Halram Goodman." "I work for Hal Goodman," Rip said, as Copeland refolded the paper and returned it to the envelope. "I'm here looking up some trouble for him. We lost 400 head of Pine Tree steers a little less than a month ago." "You came to the ranch," said Copeland. "I remember now. You were looking for cattle that had run. You—" "Let me talk a minute," said Rip. Then, touching only the high spots, Rip told Copeland the things he knew. Those things he surmised he did not touch upon. Copeland listened wordlessly. "I heard you talking when we were coming in," concluded Rip. "You had seen what that cross in a box would do to your triple dot brand. Can you see what it would do to a pine tree?" Copeland nodded. "And Whit Anders, the Pine Tree wagon boss, is lying under a pile of rocks where I put him," Rip said grimly. "I got to account for that to Goodman." "What do you want to do?" asked Copeland. "Bart is out of town. He's at his ranch. I don't see." "I ain't told you all of it," said Rip honestly. "There's some more that I'm guessing at. Do you think Little shot Summers?" "Who else?" demanded Copeland. "Hal's rifle was found in the camp, and there was a UMC shell found, and he had bought the last UMCs that Bart had. I went on his bond, but—" Copeland glanced down the street, where Little stood beside his daughter. "They got the bullet that killed Summers?" asked Rip. "Doc's got it," answered Copeland. "But what? Will you vouch for me to him?" queried Rip. Copeland considered for a moment. "I will," he decided. "I've heard of Hal Goodman. You ought to be all right, working for him." "Thanks," said Rip. "Let's go down there." Copeland nodded and, stepping away from Rip, spoke to Harvey and Charlotte. The two turned back to re-enter the store, and Copeland rejoined Rip. Together the two walked down the street, heading for the doctor's cottage. "Where's Davis?" asked Rip as they walked. "Out with Bart," answered Copeland. "He works for him in the store and does some ranch work." Rip frowned. Copeland's knock on the cottage door was answered by a small, thin, white-haired man, who peered at the two through thick-lensed glasses. "Come in," he greeted. "Did you decide that you didn't want to sign that bond after all?" "This is Rip Campbell, Doc Halgley," said Copeland. "He's here on business. Show Doc your letter, Campbell." Rip passed over Goodman's letter, and when Doc Halgley had read it through, he handed it back. "Well," he asked, "what can I do for you, Mr. Campbell?" "I know Hal Goodman. Set a leg for one of his riders once." "What is it you want?" "I'd like to see the bullet you took out of Dusty Summers," Rip answered. "In here," said Halgley. He led the way into a little, littered room that evidently served as both jus tice and medical office. There, from a desk, he picked up a slug of lead and passed it to Rip. He held that piece of lead in his hand, rolling it gently in his palm. "And you thought that Summers had been shot with Little's 30-30, he said, half-chidingly. "Look." From his shell belt, Rip produced a cartridge and held it up beside the piece of lead. The lead of the cartridge was almost identical in size with the bullet that Rip held. That bullet was deformed about the tip, but its base was not battered. "I pack a .45, Rip said gently. "That slug's from a .44-40. "Who found that UMC shell, Mr. Copeland?" "Hunter found it," Copeland answered, surprised. "He?" The triple dot owner stopped. Hal's face darkened in a frown. "Hunter," he said slowly, "carries a .44-40. "You keep that slug, Doc," warned Rip, handing back the bullet to Halgley. "It's evidence. Do you feel better about signing Little's bond now?" Copeland did not answer that question. He had turned and was striding toward the office door. "Wait," Halgley shrilled. "What's this all about?" But Copeland had gone through the door. Rip stopped in the entrance and turned. "We'll be back, Doc," he said casually. "Hang on to that slug." Then Rip Campbell, too, was gone. He caught up with Copeland before the irate ranchman reached Bart's. Putting a hand on Copeland's arm, Rip warned him. "Don't talk too much here," he said. "Let's start for the ranch. That's the first thing." Copeland nodded shortly. "You'll go back with me," he said. "Sure," agreed Rip. At the store, Copeland called Charlotte and Little. The two came out wonderingly, but their questioning looks were not answered. Copeland helped the girl into the buckboard and indicated Rip's bedroll still lying on the store porch. "Put it in," he said. Rip picked up the bedroll and tossed it into the buckboard. "I got a saddle at the barber shop too," he announced. "Likely I'll need it." "We'll get it," grated Copeland. "Get in, you two." "My saddle and stuff is at the jail," reminded Harvey Little. Darn it," swore Copeland as he glanced around. He looked nervous and concerned. "I'll get that too. Will we never get out of this hole?" The two stops to collect belongings did not take long, but Copeland fumed with impatience. It was not until they were out of town, and he had stopped his team, that the ranchman cooled at all. When he had stopped the team, he turned in his seat and held out his hand to Little, riding beside Rip in the back of the buckboard. "I'm a fool," said Copeland. "I know that you didn't have a thing to do with shooting Summers." Little took the extended hand. "I'm sure glad you believe that, Mr. Copeland," he said. "How?" "Never mind," interrupted Copeland. "This man will tell you. We're going to the ranch now." Little turned and looked at Rip. Charlotte had her arms around her father's neck and was kissing his weathered cheek. Copeland had started the team, but he didn't seem to mind the girl's exuberance. When Charlotte did free her arms, Copeland held the reins in one hand. The other arm he put around his daughter's waist. The buckboard rattled on, and Rip talked to Little. Chapter 8. When they reached the ranch, Copeland stopped the team and went straight to the cook shack. The cook knew from the boss's manner that something was afoot, but could impart no information. He didn't know where the men had ridden that day. Copeland ordered the cook to look after the buckboard team, and taking Little and Rip with him, went into the house and to his office. Charlotte had already joined her mother. The girl was apprehensive as to what was to come, but happy because Harvey was out and free, and her father believed Harvey innocent. In the office, Copeland turned to Rip Campbell. "What are you going to do now?" he inquired. Rip frowned. "I'd sort of wanted to jump Hunter," he said, "but Hunter ain't here. I reckon I'll go to the hay camp." "It'll be late," warned Copeland. "Why not wait till?" "I've been waiting," Rip said grimly. "I reckon I can finish my business at the camp pretty quick." "What are you going to do there?" asked Copeland. "I'm going to jump Walters," said Rip. "I'm going to tell him that I've found Anders and accuse him of killing Whit Anders." And then what? Copeland stared hard at Rip. Then I don't know what'll happen, said Rip simply. The way I figured it out, he started that run. He killed Whit. But he come to camp after the run. That meant that there was men helping. I think that Bart was behind it. Well, I be danged, exclaimed Copeland. I got a letter from Pueblo. I never opened it. Too excited, I guess. Wait. He produced an envelope from his coat pocket and tore it open. Scanning the sheet enclosed, he grunted and passed the missive across to Rip. Answering Copeland's request, his friend in Pueblo had written that 400 head of cross in a box steers had been sold in Pueblo 2 weeks before. The buyer of those steers, so the writer continued, said that he had contracted with Jake Bart for some 300 more steers to be delivered later in the year. There's my pine trees, Rip said grimly as he passed the letter back. And there's 300 triple dots he contracted for, replied Copeland. I reckon we might see Mr. Bart pretty soon, grated Rip. First, though, I aim to settle with Walters. I want to get Whit's body taken care of, and I want to find out who was with Bart and handled the cattle. I want a cleanup. Copeland frowned. So do I, he agreed. The trouble is, I don't know who I can trust now. Harvey here is all right, but Hunter I'd have bet on, and Hunter is crooked. He killed Dusty Summers. I would have trusted Hunter with whatever I had. Now I don't know who to trust. There's Gunny, suggested Rip. Copeland's face lighted. Sure, there's Gunny, he agreed. There was a knock on the office door, and Mrs. Copeland's voice came. I've brought a lunch for you men, she said. You'd better eat. We had better, agreed Rip, as Copeland opened the door, while we can. There were sandwiches and pie on the tray that the gray-haired Martha Copeland brought into the room. Behind her mother came Charlotte carrying the coffee pot. The men ate and drank, while the women hovered anxiously in the background. Mrs. Copeland put her hand on her husband's shoulder and looked at Rip. Trouble? She asked tremulously. Trouble. Charlotte came to stand beside Little. Do you have to go? Asked Mrs. Copeland. Couldn't you send someone? I've always killed my own snakes, said Copeland. Rip looked at the pie on his plate. There wasn't anybody to stand behind Rip Campbell. No one to worry about whether or not he went into trouble and came out of it. For an instant that bitter thought was in Rip's mind. Then suddenly he was glad that it was so. He looked up and smiled at the gray-haired woman, turned and included Charlotte in that smile. I wouldn't worry if I was you, said Rip to the two women. Martha Copeland's eyes searched Rip's face. Gradually, the worried expression she wore was supplanted by one of confidence. Charlotte, her hand on Harvey's shoulder, let a little breath of relief escape her lips. I'd like to go to the hay camp pretty quick, said Rip to Copeland. I'd like to start a wagon out of there to get. The presence of the women caused him to refrain from mentioning Whit Anders' body. I'd like to go, he finished lamely. Copeland wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Let's go then, he said. There were horses in the corral at the Triple Dot. The men roped out mounts and saddled. The two women had gone to the corrals with them, and when they mounted, Little rode close to Charlotte. Leaning down from the saddle, he kissed the girl full on the lips. Copeland did not frown, and there was a look of contentment in Martha Copeland's eyes. I'll be back tonight, said Copeland. The three rode away, leaving the women standing beside the corral gate. While it was some 3 hours past noon, the men did not hurry. There seemed to be something of a grim certainty in the way they rode. It was trot, walk, trot, and canter, covering the ground, going on inexorably like death. It seemed to Rip that he had done this before, again and yet again. Copeland rode close to him and spoke. We might have brought a deputy with us, he said. We might have? Your deputy is Jake Bart's man, reminded Rip. Copeland looked at Rip's square-cut face. And you are your own authority, he said. All right, Campbell. When we get to camp, you and Little stay on your horses, ordered Rip. There's one, maybe two men there that might make a break for it. I don't want them to get away. He knew that if Copland and Little were mounted, they could not take part in what was sure to come. He knew that Walters would not sit supine and submit to being taken. But Rip intended to be on the ground when he spoke to Walters. If Walters did submit, it would be all right. If Walters did not submit, Rip thought of Whit Anders, that would be justice too. But the play did not come up as Rip had anticipated. When the three reached the hay camp, the place was deserted except for the cook, who crawled out from under the chuck wagon to greet them. Tea. Cook was sleepy-eyed and smelled of vanilla extract. Where's Block? asked Copeland, looking down at the cook. Out in the meadow, answered the cook. You all going to stay for supper? He was eyeing Rip, not sure that he had seen the rider before, but still half recognizing him. No, answered Copeland. Anybody been here today? The cook thought a moment. Hunter was in at noon, he said. He's went down to the Bend camp. Said he'd be back. That's all that's been here. Copeland looked at Rip, his eyebrows lifted. Well, go to the camp, said Rip quietly. I reckon we'd better not try to take a wagon with us for Anders. The horses ain't in. Copeland nodded. Let's get going then, he said impatiently. Tell Block we'll be back. You better stay to supper, the cook called after them. The three left the camp and rode on toward the river. Again it was trot, walk, trot, and canter, and then as they reached the hardpan they saw a rider coming toward them. Hunter, said Little harshly. Rip saw the youngster loosen in its holster the 6-shooter that he had borrowed at the ranch. Keep that thing covered up, said Rip forcefully. Little looked at Rip, scowled, but removed his hand from the butt of the gun. As the triple-dot foreman drew closer, Rip reined his horse a little to the right, so that a small space separated him from Copeland and Little. The single man and the three drew closer and closer, and then, when Hunter saw who was approaching, he stopped his horse. The others rode up, still in their open formation, and stopped. Hello, said Hunter, addressing me Alpine, but looked at Harvey Little. You looking for me? I am, snapped Copeland. Easy, warned Rip, noting the anger in Copeland's voice. Let me. Yeah, we were looking for you, Hunter. Hunter looked at Rip, studying him. You're, he began. I'm the fella that worked for the hay crew, said Rip. Rip, you called me. I didn't take your tip about going over to Bart's. Thanks just the same, but I'm a little too wise to be sent over to be killed. Puzzlement wrote itself on Hunter's face. Killed, he echoed. The look of puzzlement could not be assumed. Rip, watching the triple-dot cow boss, was suddenly forced to revise his beliefs. Hal's voice was less certain when he spoke again. You figured on that, didn't you? He demanded. Bart wanted me over there, where him or some of his men could take care of me. I wasn't fool enough to go. Bart, said Hunter. Quit stalling, snapped Copeland. Hunter, we got the goods on you. You knew Summers was a detective that I'd got in here. You killed him and tried to plant the killing on Harvey here. I ought to let Harvey have you. Wait, ordered Rip. Hunter's face had turned white. Hal's eyes were wide and round. There was a look of appeal on his face as he stared at Rip. Your rifle was in the haystack back at camp, Hunter, said Rip accusingly. I saw you from the mesa when you got to Summers. I know that you was packing a rifle when you come in. You carry a 44-40, and Summers was killed with a 44-40. You found that 30-30 UMC shell that you claimed was from Harvey's gun. Harvey's gun was gone, and when him and I got to his camp, there it was again. You killed Summers, Hunter, and tried to plant it on Little. You can give up or go for your piece. Hunter seemed to slump. Hal's face, white beneath its tan, took on the lines of age. Hal's shoulders sagged. I never killed Summers, he blurted. I found him after he'd been shot. I saw that, said Rip grimly. You found him after you'd shot him. Hunter whimpered again. I didn't kill him. I found him, I tell you. I'd taken Little's rifle. I was going to beef 1 or 2 cows and hang it on him so Copeland would fire him. Charlotte. Keep her out of this, snapped Little. Your tongue ain't fit to speak of her. I got Billy to bring my gun in when he come to the ranch, Hunter finished weakly. He'd wanted to work for me, punching, and I got him to do it. I put Harvey's rifle back in the camp. Rip looked at Copeland. I reckon that's the truth, he said slowly. What about it, Copeland? Copeland was looking at the horn of his saddle, his face a study. Slowly he lifted his head and turned to Little. It's up to you, said Copeland. Little kept his eyes on Hunter. Hal's hand was again on the butt of his gun, clutching it. Slowly his hand relaxed. I reckon, said Little, fighting the words out, that I don't want him. Chapter 9. Rip let go the breath he held. Little had been for a moment in the position of both judge and executioner, and he had come through. Copeland let the words come slowly from his lips. You get off the place, Hunter, he said. Don't go to the ranch. Don't go near it. Pull out. Your gear will be taken to Trinchera. You can get it there, and I'll expect to find that horse in town. Get out and don't come back, and get out now. The ranch owner's face was stony. Sudden relief flooded Hunter's face. Hal's shoulders almost squared, his head came up a little. He opened his mouth to speak, but Rip forestalled that. Shut up, snapped Rip. Get going, and thank your stars you're a lucky damn fool. Hunter glanced from Rip to the others, then lifted his reins. Hal's horse stepped forward, and suddenly Hunter thrust in his spurs and the horse leapt ahead. As Rip and the other two turned, Hunter bent forward in the saddle like a man who seeks to escape pursuing lead, and with the horse running full out, swept across the hardpan. When he was gone, there was silence among the three. Then Rip, looking at Little, spoke slowly. I reckon you're fit for that girl, he said gently, and he spurred his horse. They rode back toward the hay camp. Rip's mind was busy. If Hunter had not killed Summers, and Rip was convinced that he had not killed Summers, then who was guilty? There was no answer to that. Copeland voiced the problem. Hunter didn't do it, said Copeland with conviction. Who did? A cross and a box brand, mused Rip half aloud. Copeland caught the implication. Bart, damn him, swore Copeland. When the trio sighted the hay camp, they saw activity. Men were pulling in from the meadow, bringing their teams. The fat, squat figure of Gunny was by the fire. Gunny was talking, looking up at two men who sat in a buckboard. Bart, Copeland said again. That's him. Hal's deputy's with him, said Rip slowly, for Davis sat beside Bart in the buckboard seat. Who's that in the back? Cole, snapped Harvey. Sure enough, agreed Rip. Let me do the talking. You'll spill things if you do it. You're mad. I'll talk to him, vowed Copeland. He stole Pine Tree cattle, and he's the man that had Whit killed. Rip's voice was hard. Do I talk, or do I ride in and take to shooting? Which, Copeland? You can talk, grunted Copeland, repressing his wrath. But I think. Let me talk then, snapped Rip. But Gunny did the talking when the three arrived. Copeland had no time to dismount before Gunny was at his stirrup. Bart has come over to take some of my men, announced Gunny, looking up at Copeland. I'll never get this hay cut, Ian, what with men leaving and me having to fire. Gunny caught sight of Rip. There was no hesitancy in his recognition. He broke off his complaint to Copeland. I knew you was a rider, said Block. I knew it. Rip dismounted. He was almost at the fire. Hal's horse stood behind him, and Rip moved his left hand and the horse stepped away. To Rip's right was the buckboard with Bart and Davis and Cole Cook. Cole had risen. To Rip's left were Walters and Daly. Walters had his hand in the bib of his overalls, and there was a gun in that hand. Talk about sitting on a powder keg. Rip knew that he was on one, and that a match had been lit. But from the corner of his eyes, Rip saw that Little had almost dismounted and stepped away. Little was now clear of the buckboard, and on the other side. Rip thanked his lucky stars that he was no fool. The kid was coming through in a tight. Mentally, Rip decided that Little would do to take along. Copeland on his horse was out of the picture, but Gunny had sensed that something was wrong, had felt the tension. He had stepped back so that he too was clear of Rip. To right and left, the hay hands their teams neglected were gathered, and they too watched the stage so carefully set. For a minute or two, no one moved or spoke. Each man held his position, as if a sudden command had halted him, waiting while the tension increased. Then Rip began to talk. "I wouldn't worry about losing men," said Rip carefully. "It can't be helped. You're bound to lose some once in a while. Just like a trail herd is bound to lose steers once in a while." "What?" asked Gunny. Rip looked at Walters. "I found Whit," Rip said slowly, almost casually. "Found him just where you'd left him. You got your gun back out of my bedroll, didn't you?" It was an invitation. Walters recognized it as such, but he did not want to accept that invitation. He wanted to live a while longer, and he was afraid. Rip waited. When Walters did not move, he spoke again. This time to Jake Bart. "Them pine tree steers you sold in Pueblo, Bart," he said. "Did you get a price for them? Hal Goodman will want to know." It seemed to Walters in that instant that Rip had taken his eyes from him. It seemed to Walters that this was the chance he wanted. Here were Bart and Cook and Daly all on his side. Here was the law in the person of Davis, and the law was also on his side. Walters brought his hand from the bib of his overalls, and there was a gun in that hand, his own .41 Colt. But Walters had been mistaken. Rip stepped back a little as Walters moved. As he stepped back, he dropped his hand in a short arc. Both guns roared, and while Rip staggered from the slug that brushed through his sleeve and grazed his arm, Walters stood erect with surprise on his face and then pitched down. He twitched, then lay still. Gunny called sharply, "Stop it, Daly." Rip had no time to look at Daly. He had seen Bart drop the lines to the buckboard's team, and he had seen Cook drop back into the bed of the buckboard. As he dropped the lines, Bart had stooped, and the twin muzzles of a shotgun now appeared. Rip, coolly as though shooting at a target, sent slugs whistling into the dash of the buckboard. The shotgun barrels tilted up and one discharged, belching lead against the sky. Then the barrels fell. Davis, face ashen, sat on the seat of the buckboard and lifted his hands high, reaching up as though he could not get them high enough, and Little was walking toward the rear of the buckboard, the gun in his hand sending up a little trail of smoke. "That's right," said Gunny's voice. "Reach." Then the hay hands were crowding in, and Copeland, a mixture of awe and force in his voice, was ordering them back. Rip was standing over Walters, looking down at the man he had killed. As he stared at the white face, Rip was conscious that his hate for Walters had gone now, as if it disappeared in the blue gunpowder smoke that dissipated in the wind. Justice was done. There was no feeling in him except relief. Hal's job was finished. It took some time to get things sorted out. Cook was dead in the back of the buckboard. There was a .44-40 rifle in Cole's hands, but only 2 shells were discharged. Cole had made the mistake of shooting at Rip while Little was shooting at him. Cole would make no more mistakes. Little held the rifle up to .44-40, said Little. "Here's the man that killed Summers, I reckon." Bart had dropped the shotgun and was lying across Davis's feet. Bart would see no more steers that year. He would never plan again to sell steers or to run them over the Badlands and down across the hardpan to the river. Daly held his hands high, as did Davis. Both were white with fear, for they had come through death and were still alive. Such experiences shake a man, however hard, and Davis and Daly were willing to talk. Indeed, they concurred and amplified Rip's explanation, the explanation he gave to Gunny and the hay hands gathered about. While the two prisoners talked, old Gunny kept staring at Rip and nodding as if he had expected all this would happen. Davis and Daly had been with Bart and Cook the night the pine tree steers had run. They had helped Walters bury Whit Anders on the sandbar. He ought not to have killed Whit, Davis wailed. There wasn't no sense in killing him. Bart said so. Bart had it all framed with Walters to run the cattle. It was the cross and a box brand that put the business into his head. He seen where he could blot the pine tree brand, and he seen where he could change the triple dot. He had it all planned so we could make our killing and get away. Rip had been right, too. As to the method of running off the cattle, Davis and Daly agreed. They also told of how Bart had held the steers in a ring-wrapped mesa on his own ranch, and how the brands had been altered before the cattle were sold. And Cook had killed Summers. Bart had ordered it when he had learned that Summers was a stock detective and had seen Summers on his side of the river. A nice, tight little corporation it had been, with Bart, a respectable merchant and ranchman, at its head, and Walters, Daly, Cook, and Davis to do the dirty work. "If he hadn't been so sly, we'd have made it," said Scott Davis bitterly. "Having Cook get on with the triple dot to see where the cattle were placed, and putting Walters and Daly in here with the Granger wagon was what upset things." When the story had been told, bodies were loaded into a wagon. Gunny dispatched another wagon and 2 men to the Badlands for Whit Anders' body. The cook swore because his steak was burned, and the men, talking still and excited, drifted away toward the fire. Daly and Davis were bound and placed in the wagon with the bodies of those others. Gunny, on the seat beside the driver, watched his prisoners on their trip to the ranch. Then it was that Little bound Rip's arm with a clean white handkerchief, and the 3 men mounted to ride back to the triple dot. Late that night, at the headquarters ranch, Rip wrote 2 letters. Both letters were to Hal Goodman, and both were identical, but one was addressed to the Alps Hotel in Denver, and the other to the Pine Tree Ranch at San Angelo. "Dear Mr. Goodman, I have found Whit Anders, and he will be buried here in his country. Walters killed him the night the herd ran. Walters is going to be buried up here, too. You will have to collect off the estate of a man named Jake Bart for the steers. He sold them as cross-in-a-box cattle in Pueblo. Mr. Copeland of the Triple Dot Ranch here, near Trinchera, will help you. I hope you won't have no trouble. As you will have to collect for the steers, I don't know if you will want to give me that $2 a head or not, but that will be all right, as I am leaving here for San Angelo in about a week, and we can talk it over then. I am having to stay here for a week at least because they say they can't get ready for the wedding in less time than that, and I am going to be best man, and I have got to stay for the inquests, hoping that you don't have no trouble about the steers. I am. Yours truly, Rip Campbell." Carrying his literary masterpieces, Rip went from Copeland's office and to the porch. Down at the bunkhouse, there were lights where the Triple Dot riders and Gunny sat as guards upon Davis and Arthur Daly. There were no lights in the old bunkhouse, but it was occupied. There were 4 bodies there. Whit Anders lay beside the men that had killed him. On one end of the porch, a cigar tip glowed. Copeland sat there with his arm about his wife. There was no light on the other end of the porch, but little sounds came to Rip. Small, soft sounds as of a kiss given and returned. Rip, grinning a little, put the letters he had written into his hip pocket. Very silently, he turned and walked back into the house. Seated once more in Copeland's office, Rip reopened his 2 letters, unfolded them, and picked up his pencil. He sucked the pencil thoughtfully for a moment, and then, the grin broadening, added a postscript. "P.S. It looks like I might be able to get away a little quicker. The end. Do you like wild western adventure? Can I send you a full-length novel free? Get your copy today. Rather, listen. I have over 30 wild western audiobooks you can hear for free. Saddle up and click play today."